Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. Lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. Wow, have I got some exciting news for you guys. Well, let me tell you what's happening. It's absolutely amazing. Oh gosh, I'm fighting with this window. Okay, I'm just going to leave it there. I have some very exciting breaking news. A few days ago, we had Reino de Beer on the live stream regarding his pending court action over the lockdown. I'm going to read from a press release I will put on the screen. And I will also put in the side chat a link to where you can download the actual document that I'm going to be talking about. Okay, let me show you the press release that Liberty Fighters Network released just a few minutes ago. So this is hot off the press. Here we go. I'll read you the first 4 paragraphs because this is very, very important. Okay, so the headline is Liberty Fighters overjoyed with lockdown victory for the people. Let us make a toast with a legal smoke. What a headline. And he goes on to say, in a court judgment which speaks of pure genius, Justice Norman Davis effectively brought an end to the hard lockdown which plagued the people of South Africa the past 3 months, seeing a futile, ever-increasing number of COVID-19 cases at a constant 0.1% daily rate since mid-May. The High Court Gauteng Division Pretoria has ordered yesterday, the 30th of June 2020, that the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, may, for what is still its worth, appeal her disaster management regulations to the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein, but not those regulations which clearly violated basic human rights of all our people and gave her 10 days to formally get rid of it. However, this period is only academic and does not overrule the Declaration of Invalidity. Tongue twister. Liberty Fighters Network and its president, Reino de Beer, were overjoyed when they received the order of the High Court, Gauteng Division, Pretoria, in the application for leave to appeal late yesterday afternoon, wherein Davis J. ordered that, above others, the restrictions on all businesses, religious and other gatherings, exercises, walking on the beach and the public parks, freedom of movement, must stand as obvious constitutional violations. No doubt. Now, this is where the genius comes in, okay? A surprise move, Justice Davis also excluded Regulation 48.2 from the appeal, which forms the heart of the government's stronghold over us as a people in the lockdown, by having decriminalized the violation of the lockdown regulations in respect of the holding of funerals, Regulation 35, initiations, Regulation 38, access to all events, Regulation 39, on-premises liquor consumption, Regulation 44, and the sale of tobacco, Regulation 45. Yes, we believe that although the sale of tobacco is still technically prohibited in terms of Regulation 45, the court has brilliantly now also ordered that the sale of tobacco does not carry criminal prosecution anymore, and leaving government with the only way of enforcement following a civil process. The police and other law enforcers may legally not enforce the unlawful sale of tobacco anymore. So there you go. Further, and for the majority, the most important, wearing of masks is obligatory, Regulation 5 and 33, but not something which could lead to your arrest and criminal prosecution in terms of Regulation 14 and 48 anymore. Liberty Fighters Network is advocating anyone who so wishes may now legally remove their masks and not be arrested or criminally. Declaration of invalidity has already declared those regulations excluded from the appeal to be invalid and of no effect, and the measures in terms of level 3 are merely academic in nature. So there's an official press release. As I'm going to just put in the website link where you can actually download the court document, which Reno sent me a short while ago. Second, guys. This is going to be worth it. It's lfn.pdf. Okay, so if you want to look at the document while we're having the live stream, you can download it right there. Okay, let's continue. Now, tonight, we have another beautiful painting that we're going to be auctioning, and all the money from this auction is going directly to Isaac van Zyl's costs for an urgent triple bypass operation. I'll just tell you what the painting's all about. Let me just get it on the screen so you can look at it. Here we go. Okay, there it is. Now, the painting is 73 by 73 centimeters in size. It's an oil on canvas. The artist is Alida Mostert, and the name is the Lion. Well, that's pretty obvious. Please put your bids in the side chat as follows. Painting and the Rand value bid, which can be the amount but must be higher than the previous bid. Now the starting price for this painting is 5,000 Rand, and it's a beauty. Let me show you something. This is amazing. Look at the detail in that eye. That's just one of the eyes of the lion. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? All right, guys, I'm going to just quickly give you a bit of background to our guest tonight, who's Peter Hammond. Let me just get this sorted. Okay. Right, now, Peter Hammond, what a remarkable man. He's a missionary who has pioneered evangelistic outreaches in the war zones of Mozambique, Angola, and Sudan, often traveling by off-road motorbike. He is the founder and director of Frontline Fellowship, the founder and chairman of Africa Christian Action, the director of the Christian Action Network, and the chairman of the Reformation Society. For over 26 years, Peter has been dedicated to assisting persecuted Christians and to work for reformation and revival in Africa. Now, let me get Peter on so we can have our discussion. Give me a second, guys. While I'm getting him on, have a look at this incredible painting. Yeah. Hi, Peter.
Hey, Hey, how are you doing?
Excellent, thank you. Excellent. Wow, that's a good range of books behind your head.
That's just part of them.
And I wonder how many of those you've written, because you've written a whole bunch of books, haven't you?
I've written a few, and here's my kitty saying hello.
Oh, lovely. What's his or her name?
This is Olivia. She's our oldest cat at home.
Oh, she's gorgeous.
One of 6.
Absolutely gorgeous. Now, I've done a bit of an intro. I don't know if you heard the news, but the harsh lockdown is now officially illegal. Court ruling made yesterday, and
Are you talking about Australia or South Africa?
South Africa. And
very good.
And there's a document which I'll send you the link later in the side chat of Skype. You can have a look at the actual court document. And yeah, it's very, very exciting. Now,
that is extremely good news.
It is fantastic news, isn't it? Now, Peter, we're going to be talking about a very, very interesting subject tonight. We're talking about psychological warfare, which is, becoming more and more common, especially with the online medium that we have today. Now, just as an opening gambit, psychological warfare is basically actions taken to reduce an opponent's morale. I mean, that sums it up, doesn't it, basically?
Yes, psychological warfare is warfare tactics designed to undermine an enemy's ability to resist. So psychological warfare involves tactics intended to manipulate your opponents or your enemies, and this includes disseminating propaganda, we understand that, but also disinformation. In fact, the Soviet Union always had a department of disinformation, and they aimed to undermine the morale of the enemy forces and erode their ability to resist. So this is what Sun Tzu even spoke about 2,400 odd years ago,
right,
that the art of war involves the best way of fighting is not to defeat your enemy in battle, but to defeat him without a battle, to make him give up. And in fact, we've seen how the communists have been very bad at war. They've lost a lot of battles, but they tend to win through psychological warfare, through asymmetrical or irregular warfare, rather than on the battlefield. And that certainly has been our experience in South Africa, where we won all the battles. Rhodesia won all the battles too on the field. But the war was not just on the battlefield. We beat them militarily, but they were subverting and eroding our society and undermining the people's desire to win the war. So, for example, famously, the Vietnamese commander declared after 1975 that the Vietnamese army had not won the war militarily, but the US media had enabled the Vietnamese army to win the war on the battlefield of the university campuses in America and in the living rooms through the TV coverage of the protests of the war. And so he gave, that's quite something for a military commander of an army to say, we didn't actually win the war. Thank you to the American media for winning the war for us in the living rooms and in the classrooms and on the battlefields of the minds of the American population. So that just shows how powerful war can be, that you might have the greatest superpower in the world with a phenomenal military ability, but you can still lose the war through psyops.
Wow, that you've just opened up a Pandora's box here. There's so much I want to talk to you about that, but we'll get to that later. Let's get a full understanding of what psychological warfare is about. Now, what does Psyops target? Now, Psyops is basically an abbreviation for psychological warfare, isn't it?
Well, yes, basically there's two sides. There's Psy-war and there's Psyops. Now, psychological warfare is always aimed at enemy forces, but psychological operations is aimed at your own forces and also at the civilian population, what might be called local population, because between your army and their army is a whole lot of neutral, independent people who would prefer to be left alone, actually, who might not have much love lost for either side of the, and they don't like soldiers checking them at checkpoints and roadblocks and all this sort of thing and house searches. Anyway, so as you've got psychological warfare, which is enemy forces, undermine their morale, expose their atrocities, expose their weaknesses, publish their failures, and also Psy-war can involve black ops, of course, Now, there's white propaganda and there's black propaganda. Black propaganda is when it is secret. It's you might put out the propaganda pretending it came from a neutral source, or even that it came from the enemy's source. That's black propaganda. But white propaganda is your propaganda. It's your publication. It's obviously in your name. It's got your country's origin on. So white propaganda is just open, look at us, we're doing a great job, we're wonderful, look how many clinics we've opened and the bridge we built and the water pumps we've installed, and that sort of thing. But there's black ops, which can be false flag operations. There can even be terrorist operations designed to make it look like the other side did it. So that's a black ops. So there's Psy-war and there's Psyops. Right. And there's Psy-war for the enemy, there's Psyops for your own forces, and then there's Psyops to try and win the hearts and minds of the local population or the poor targeted civilians who some are stuck in the middle and would rather be left alone, and who can blame them?
Right. Wow, that's fascinating. Now, modern mass communication techniques have allowed unprecedented opportunity for foreign forces to engage in direct communication with a targeted enemy or population. Tell us about that.
Yes, so before the First World War, there was very little way that you could target the enemy's population. Right. Very, very, very hard, because all the communication systems tended to be within a country, and so it was extremely hard to reach the population on the other side. But in the First World War, they now had radio, and so they could try and broadcast for the other side's civilian population or military to listen, and so you'd have Tokyo Rose, and you'd have different types of radio programs. And of course, with leaflet production, they could distribute this by air. This is even done in the First World War, but a lot more in the Second World War, where you'd do leaflet drops over the enemy, point out to them how bad their situation is and why they should surrender or give up and things like that, and promising them good treatment if they surrender. So you had it getting a little bit wider. But now, with the internet and with a World Wide Web, and with so much mass communications opportunity through satellite and so on, literally you can have a person or country or group target any population anywhere in the world. And this has made Psyops, in fact, no longer just an important facet of warfare, but it's made it the most important facet. And today, most countries are putting a vast amount more attention into the Psyops side than they would be putting into the military technology. And examples of this is how the Soviet Union gave the highest priority to the Department of Disinformation and the Department of Psychological Warfare. And Red China, I think, has broken all bounds. They are doing a phenomenal amount of psychological, asymmetrical, what they call unrestricted warfare as well. So today we're in a realm where you can take quite a few examples, but just take how in 1988, under Ronald Reagan, the American Department of Defense published their analysis of communism worldwide, which included analyzing the different terrorists. They would print in a very nice, full-color, glossy publication, nicely bound. And I get these publications, and I remember looking through it, and it was very interesting as they would analyze right down to all the military capabilities of every Soviet country and every Soviet satellite and every terrorist group that was under them and so on. And one of the comments, which was intriguing, 1988, the African National Congress of South Africa, which is an arm of the Southern Communist Party, completely controlled by Moscow, is the most spectacularly unsuccessful revolutionary group in the world. They have not one single military success to their name, despite vast amounts of funding and weaponry and training and all that. And so that there was this disdain for this total, complete, abject failure of the ANC, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo's African National Congress, who today are the government of South Africa. And there's an example of they were a complete and total and utter failure from any military point of view, from even a revolutionary point of view. However, they had allies in the South African Council of Churches and in the South African media in the universities, a lot of the professors and lecturers were subverting the population of South Africa on a daily basis, attacking everything of value, everything that the people would look up to or respect, breaking down the confidence and the morale of the people of South Africa to such an extent that people no longer felt that South Africa was worth fighting for, that South Africa was worth defending, and that basically you could say that in South Africa, while we won the war spectacularly, the Southern Defence Force was spectacularly successful on the battlefront in Southwest Africa on the border of Angola, in Avambaland, in Angola, and in the Angolan Civil War from 1975 to 1990, what South Africa did was spectacular in supporting UNITA freedom fighters to liberate more than a third. At some stages, it was more like a half of the total territory of Angola was free Angola under the control of Jonas Savimbi's UNITA freedom fighters.
Right.
And the South African Army confronted Soviet forces and Cuban forces on divisional strength, where there was the biggest tank battles in the history of Africa since the Second World War, since El Alamein actually. And South Africa won, despite being outnumbered colossally, inflicted out of all proportion damages and casualties on the communist forces. And to the extent that Fidel Castro had his best friend and one of his original buddies put against the wall and shot for treason for losing the war against South Africa. The Marshal Marshal Sanjay of the Soviet forces. He was the Cuban highest ranking. He was over all communist forces in Angola, right. The supreme commander. He was put on trial for losing the war in Angola and shot. Now, you don't shoot the general of a victorious army. So South Africa was spectacularly successful militarily and unbeatable militarily. But Psyops, and the carrots and the sticks. So South Africa was being under a total war, and President P.W. Botha was actually derided in the media for speaking about a total onslaught and a total war in South Africa. But history's proven him correct, because there was a total war. There was complete economic sanctions on South Africa, which didn't seem to cause any problem because our country just produced better. The arms sanctions, well, we started to produce such good armaments, arms corps, that we even had America buying our G5s, G6s, and the attack helicopters, the Rofalk, which they renamed the Apache. And we produced such superior weaponry that we were able to take on the best that the Soviets had, like the MiG-29s and our cheetahs in dogfights. Our upgrade of the Mirage 3s took them down in one-on-one combat inside Angola. And so South Africa did fine under economic sanctions. But where we didn't do so fine was on the cultural boycott, where South Africans couldn't go very far on a South African passport, and the cultural boycott, which affected sports, where we couldn't play rugby and cricket with Australia and New Zealand. Now, that really hurt, and we couldn't take part in the Olympics. And so the carrot and the stick approach became quite effective, because what happened now is 1992, there's going to be the Barcelona Olympics, and a carrot offered was you could take part in the Barcelona Olympics if you release Mandela, unban the ANC, and all these sort of things. And this is what started to actually gain the interest of South Africans who we'd been fighting for 32 years against communist terrorists, winning every single battle. But the Psy War had eroded a lot of the South Africans' ability, so they were actually being fascinated by the idea of cricket with Australians, rugby with the New Zealanders, Olympics. And in fact, it was proven that the vast majority of white South African voters who voted in the referendum in 1992, which gave the blank check to F.W. de Klerk, voted yes because of the carrot of rugby, cricket, and Olympics. And so you could just see the ultimate power of Psy War. This was well summarized by the Prime Minister of Rhodesia. Ian Smith said, "We were never beaten by our enemies. We were betrayed by our friends." And in South Africa, we could add, we were betrayed by our own government, actually. And Psy War achieved what they couldn't win on the battlefield.
I want to get onto F.W. de Klerk in a second, but before we do, I just want to address the people watching right now. First off, please remember to subscribe to this channel. We always have fascinating live streams. Don't forget we've got this painting that's on auction. I'm not sure what the current bid is, but the opening bid was 5,000 Rand. So please, guys, get your bids in. This is a beautiful painting. All the money is going directly to General Isaac van Zyl to help with his bypass. So it's basically going to help this guy out. Don't hesitate to put a bid in there. And yeah, so let's continue here. Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to say is please remember to put your questions in the side chat too. I'll put those to our guest later. Now, Peter, getting to F.W. de Klerk, what was his role in all this? Because he certainly hasn't got any friends in amongst the minority.
Yes, this is quite interesting because F.W. de Klerk, he was the Minister of Education at one stage, and in 1988 he threatened to take the Accelerate Christian Education people, Christian homeschoolers, including pastors that I know, to jail if they didn't take the government curriculum, which then was Christian National Education, but was still national education, it was state education. And the homeschooling pastors who are running these Christian schools using the Accelerate Christian Education program said, you can take us to jail, but we will not compromise. And at the end, de Klerk had to back off and recognize the right of Christian schoolers to have their own curriculum.
Right.
So that was interesting. So we got a little early look at where de Klerk stands. Now, in 1989, P.W. Botha, who was the strong anti-communist leader, he gave the Southern Defense Force, I think, its greatest freedoms and opportunities. When he became Minister of Defense, Southern Defense Force was not even 10% what became later. He accelerated the Arms Corps program, the SADF, and he unleashed us on the cross-border preemptive raids, which won us some of our greatest victories ever. So P.W. Botha was seen as a great friend of the military, and we liked him, we loved him. I met P.W. Botha, and I highly respected him, and he's a good man. In fact, we published the book of his son-in-law just last year, Undefined South Africa. His son-in-law was once his bodyguard and married his daughter, and who's been a good friend of ours for over 34 years. So the book Undefined South Africa's phenomenal insight also to what an honorable, decent Christian man P.W. Botha was. P.W. Botha was so principled that, for example, his bodyguard, who's now son-in-law, said that he would never use the state vehicle for if he is going to the farm or he's going horse riding or he's going to church on Sunday. He would use his own private vehicle, and he'd insist on paying for the fuel for that. And he is so precise on what was state business and what was private business, and a real principled man, lived a humble life, and brought in, whether it was the bodyguards, the police, the soldiers, and so on, around a dinner table, and just how he said in all the years that he worked next to him and was guarding and guiding him, he never once heard a bad word, forget a swear word, didn't even hear an uncharitable word from him. He said he was such a Christian gentleman, which is extraordinary. But anyway, P.W. Botha was a great man, and again in this book is testified that this so-called report of him having a stroke is a fraud. It was an attempted assassination. He was poisoned without a shadow of a doubt. And
right.
Anyway, you get this from his daughter, you get it from his son-in-law, and I've had his granddaughter attending our Great Commission courses in our mission, working with us, climbing over the mountains, doing work in the streets. So we know their family well. And P.W. Botha was hit with such a serious poison. It should have caused him to die, but he was as strong as an ox and he survived, and he recovered so fast, which is not possible if he had had a stroke, which is when they reported it was a stroke.
Right.
And the bodyguard knew that there was none of the stroke symptoms. And anyway, more of that gets into the book. And he shows how basically what was happening is P.W. Botha saw his entire cabinet was against him. They were moving to wanting to have negotiations with the ANC. They were giving into the Psyops, and they were interested in handing over. I mean, bear in mind, in the context of 1989, because we had the greatest escalation of the war through the 80s. Remember, on the American side, you had Ronald Reagan. In Britain, you had Margaret Thatcher. In Germany, you had Helmut Kohl. South Africa, you had P.W. Botha. And in 1980s, freedom went on the offensive. And we were, as a Bible smuggler, as a missionary to persecute churches, working behind the Iron Curtain and smuggling through Checkpoint Charlie and all that. It was so exciting. The 80s was the greatest decade you could imagine in my lifetime, for sure. And we had victories on the border, and I'd be able to see a lot of this because I was a guest speaker, often going up the border, ministering as a guest of the chaplains or ComOps. ComOps was communications operation, own forces, and they'd invite me to come and give lectures on what I'd seen in communist countries, where I was one of the few South Africans who'd been in many communist terrorist camps, and therefore as a regular speaker. And I calculate that I had well over 1,200 public meetings in South African Army bases, and when I say bases, it went from the biggest to out in the field, camping with the men, on the border, on the cut line, behind the lines, in enemy territory, and on raids and so on. So I knew what was going on, and I've been in the graveyards of Soviet tanks where there's just hundreds of wrecked trucks, tanks, armored cars, shot down. Yeah, and you can still see it. You can Google Earth Lomba River Bridge, and you'll still see today the charred out wrecks of these bombed out, burned out Soviet T-54s and T-62s and the BRDMs and the BDMs and everything else, and just absolute carnage wreaked by the South African Army on the Soviets. And that's the high watermark of the Soviet Union's expansion. There are books out, by the way, written by Russians who fought in Angola, the end of the Soviet Union. And Angola, we never saw it, not even in Afghanistan. And Russian officers who fought in Angola, who said that the fall of the Soviet Union and the loss of the Soviet Empire and the failure of the Cold War from a Soviet perspective, they said, culminated in Angola. The Soviets, they said, knew that they could not win a nuclear war with the West. But they dared to believe that they could win a conventional war against NATO. But when they could not even beat the South African Army, which was isolated under arms sanctions and every other kind of sanctions in Angola with the best Soviet weaponry, and when the South African Army defeated them in Angola, their morale was shaken. And of course, you've got to get the whole of the context. The context is freedom's on the offensive. We've got Ronald Reagan in America supporting the Contras, the anti-communist guerrillas in Nicaragua, helping the Mujahideen, arming them with Stinger missiles, bring down Soviet Hind helicopters in Afghanistan. Some support going to UNITA, not much from America, but they did send them Stinger missiles. And South Africa, of course, helping UNITA and helping Renamo in Mozambique. And so solidarity being supported in Poland. And so the Soviet Empire's facing resistance on all sides. And that's part of the context. So from the South African Army's perspective, in the 1980s, our cross-border raids, more and more spectacular, our military achievements incredibly great and greater, leading up to the culminations of operations Packer, Hooper, and Modular in 1986, 87, into 88. And in these operations, we were facing face-on the Soviet, the Cuban, and the MPLA armies of Angola, the communists. And there were Vietnamese, there were Koreans, North Koreans there. There were people from a wide range, Bulgarian advisors, Romanians. It's like the whole Warsaw Pact was congealed in Angola.
Right.
And we were involved in this, and we won. And so you can imagine the euphoria. And I was, for example, I was married in 1989. I was captured by the communists in Mozambique in 1989, within 6 months being married. I was in danger of being put against the wall and shot in a firing squad. Very dramatic year. I had, on my honeymoon, smuggled Bibles behind the Iron Curtain into Eastern Europe with my parents-in-law, veteran Bible smugglers, Reverend Bill Bathman, devoted his whole life to ministering to persecuted churches. So extraordinary experiences that I'd had in 1989. And at the end of 1989, we saw the Berlin Wall come down. We saw the Iron Curtain collapse. We saw one of the other of the Soviet satellite states collapse from Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, most spectacularly Romania, where my wife and I had just been there in Easter ministering in Romania, and our friends informing us, and we've still got the Romanian flag with a hole cut in the middle where they cut out the communist red star and all that. It was an exuberant year. So 1989 was like, it was the high point of the war, of the Cold War and the war against communism. And we saw such phenomenal victories. So to us, we'd won the war. The war was over.
Yeah.
The Cubans were leaving Angola. The Soviets had left Angola. The Soviet empire was on its last legs and about to collapse. And at that moment, when we'd won, F.W. de Klerk leads a coup to overthrow the South African president, who's super popular, P.W. Botha, at the height of his strength. And P.W. Botha is knocked sideways by what was reported as a stroke, but which was certainly an assassination attempt. And up comes the National Party Broederbond, behind-the-scenes leftists, who it turns out later were actually being funded and supported and pushed by Anglo-American Harry Oppenheimer's De Beers company. And that's not a theory. That's not a theory, that's a fact, because in 1995, Harry Oppenheimer published an op-ed that's a full page inside the Rand Daily Mail and the Star and a whole lot of other key newspapers in South Africa, which, by the way, Anglo-American owns. And with his face under his name, full page facing the editorial, there was this whole page saying, this is what we've been working for. Anglo-American De Beers has been working since 1960 to bring the end to apartheid, to bring the National Party government down, to bring the ANC to power, to bring Nelson Mandela as president. And so this is a year after Mandela became president. Oppenheimer, the head of De Beers, the CEO of Anglo-American, doesn't admit, he boasts, he proclaims, this has been our work. For 35 years, we've been working to effectively, I mean, he didn't use the word, but I'd use the word, to sabotage, undermine, and it was treason, actually, to overthrow the entire order that we had in South Africa, which was anti-communist, and put it in the hands of communist revolutionaries. So from our perspective, you've got to understand this is absolutely mind-boggling. The American military had analyzed the ANC as the most spectacularly unsuccessful revolutionary movements in the world, as recently as 1988 and 1989 as well. I got that book in hand. The ANC was nothing. What could they do? They didn't own a piece of territory. They didn't control any liberated territory. They had never faced the South African Defence Force in any battle. They hadn't won. Their only achievements were a bit of sabotage here and there. You know, petrol bomb through a window of a black policeman's home, a grenade through a window of some black town councillor's home, necklace murdering some town councillors, murdering some black policemen or citizens who were trying to vote in their municipal or provincial elections. So the ANC was just a very unsuccessful terrorist group, and they hadn't succeeded in anything from a military point of view. They tried to blow up the nuclear power station Cape Town. Good thing they failed at that. They had tried to blow up the Koeberg power station, and then also Sasol oil from coal refineries up in Orange Free State. They had tried to do a whole bunch of things. They tried to mortar the South African headquarters in Futterhoogte. It didn't hit anything. They missed everything they aimed at. So they hadn't actually had one single military success whatsoever in all their years. And to suddenly see the South African Defence Force trying to do resuscitation of a completely failed group, a group that was as unable to win any military successes as possible, it made no sense. This wasn't like Vietnam, Saigon, 1975, the enemy's pouring in, Americans are evacuating by helicopter. It was nothing like that. Why did South Africa, at the time that the Cold War was won, when the Soviet Union was in retreat, when the ANC had lost all of their sponsors, they had, well, as far as we knew, the Soviet sponsors at least, we didn't at that time know about Anglo-American and De Beers and a whole lot of capitalist traitors behind the scenes who were aiding and abetting the Marxists, which we didn't actually appreciate at that stage. Right. But from a military perspective, the Cubans were gone, the Russians were gone. They weren't getting their overseas support as far as we knew militarily. And then de Klerk resuscitates him. So there's an interesting sideline to this, because in 2014, that's 6 years ago, South Africa was celebrating 20 years of freedom.
Right. Yeah.
And so my daughter was part of the Cape Town Youth Choir, and she sung all over the world with them, and even up to Riga and Bratislava and Hamburg. And so wonderful opportunities, and Cape Town's got a wonderful youth choir, very well respected worldwide. But she sang in the place of the book, which was original University of Cape Town. It was actually the University of the Cape of Good Hope, which Cecil Rhodes's money managed to buy up and close down and appropriate, and so it's no longer a university, so that his University of Cape Town would be the only university in Cape Town. Most Cape Townians don't even know there was a University of Good Hope. But so this beautiful place of the book, the choir was singing, and F.W. de Klerk and his new wife, because he wasn't satisfied with betraying his country and his betraying his church and betraying his party, he betrayed his wife too. So, who surprisingly got murdered almost immediately when they divorced, and that may be a coincidence. But they were sponsoring the Cape Town Youth Choir to come and sing there, and my daughter, knowing my political position, was warning me, "Dad, please don't make a scene. Dad, please don't embarrass." And, obviously I'll do anything for my beloved daughter, so I determined I'd behave myself and I wouldn't make a scene. The previous time I'd met F.W. de Klerk, I'd refused to shake his hand, and it was after he had released Mandela and so on. I was summoned along with 200 other church leaders in South Africa to presidency, the presidential home in Pretoria, and F.W. de Klerk met us all there, and he's apparently wanting to consult with us, because he didn't care what any evangelical said. He's only listening to what the Marxists said in the Southern Council of Churches. But at one point, when everyone was lining up to get their photo ops with F.W. de Klerk, I walked off and went to get some tea, chatted to some people, and as I got my tea from the table and I turned around, there was F.W. de Klerk right by me, and his hand was out to shake my hand, and I just stared at him, and I walked past and didn't shake his hand. And I was so angry at what he had done and what he is doing to our country, even though this was just 1990, but I could see the writing on the wall, that I'm sorry I didn't say anything. Later, I thought of what I would have liked to have said to him. I would have liked to have said, "I don't shake hands with people who shake hands with terrorists." Yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't think of saying that at the time. I said absolutely nothing, and I walked away. So my daughter, concerned that I might do something rude like that, pleaded with me to behave myself. So I went there, determined to behave myself, but also wondering, how could I use this opportunity to advantage? So during tea time, I approached F.W. de Klerk, and bear in mind, this is April 2014. It's just after Nelson Mandela died in December 2013, and the Mandela Long Walk to Freedom film had come out. So I'd actually done a review of the Mandela Long Walk to Freedom, I think the only hostile review. It's a movie guide, and I gave it a -4, and which is intentionally evil, and it led to something like 100 radio and TV interviews at the time, because Mandela died, and I think if anyone wanted to find some alternative opinion on Mandela, I was the most prominent person at that moment. So I walked up to F.W. de Klerk and I said, "Mr. de Klerk, have you seen the Mandela Long Walk to Freedom film? Because I'd be interested to know what you thought of how you and the negotiation process was portrayed." Mr. Klerk smiled and he said, "No, I've not seen the film, and I've got no intention of seeing the film, but based as it is on his book, I'm sure it's not accurate in portraying either myself or the negotiation process." So I said, "Mr. Klerk, could you correct me if I'm wrong?" I said, "My impression was that we won the war and we initiated the peace. My understanding was that the South African government, from a position of strength after winning the war in Angola, after defeating the Cubans and Soviet-led forces in Angola, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the withdrawal of Soviet forces, that we took the opportunity to initiate peace with our defeated enemies, whereas in this film, the impression is that the ANC won the war and they were gracious to their defeated enemies, the White National Party of South Africa. I said, have I misunderstood something? And Mr. Clerk then smiled and he said, no, you are quite right, he said. We were negotiating from a position of strength. We had won the war. We did initiate the peace. He said, the National Party could still be the governing party of this country, had we chosen to be, and he said, I could still be its president. But he said, we would still be at war. I said, well, Mr. de Klerk, there's a lot of us out there who would prefer to have still been at war to what we've got right now. We've got vastly more civilians being murdered every year than we ever lost on the border in all 26 years of the war. We lose more people every single year, and by that I'm meaning many cases women and pensioners and old people murdered in their farms. My impression is this peace is far worse than the war that we had. And he said, you're right. However, we would not be accepted by the international community. We would not be able to be having our sports internationally. We wouldn't be able to travel internationally. He said, apartheid was morally indefensible, and we had to accommodate the ANC to be accepted internationally. I said, but Mr. de Klerk, we could have abolished apartheid. In fact, we had abolished apartheid before you even released Mandela. If I'm not mistaken, there was only 2 pieces of apartheid legislation left for you to abolish, and there was no apartheid legislation left for Mr. Mandela to abolish, because your predecessor, P.W. Botha, had abolished all the pillars of apartheid. And all we had left was the separate voters' rolls for the election and the birth certificates registering the race of the people, which wasn't even being enforced, even though it was on the statute books. And I know that because my 2 daughters were born 1991 and 1993 have no race on their passports, whereas my sons, born 95 and 99 under Mandela, have their race on it. So race classification was brought back by Mandela, but it was scrapped under P.W. Botha. So when I mentioned it, he said, that's true, but he says, we have the moral high ground because we negotiate from a position of strength and we voluntarily handed over power. Now, this is how the conversation went. And I thought it was fascinating to get somebody like Mr. de Klerk, who, to be honest, if it wasn't for my daughter pleading with me to behave myself and not insult him, I wouldn't have got all that information out because I would have probably been more confrontational. So it was fascinating and I later followed this up with a letter to Mr. de Klerk, just clarifying some things, and I got back on his letterhead signed by him, a letter confirming the main points of what I'd said, which was absolutely invaluable. And when I shared this with my military friends through the Veteran Association and so on, they were not only fascinated, many were outraged because they knew how he had betrayed us. We won the war, and he betrayed the country.
Now, but there's so many things that I could be asking you right now, but there's one statement I'd like to make. Mention the Oppenheimers and Anglo-American and how they were involved in all this. Now, I'll tell you a story. I had a farm in the Drakensberg in the early 1980s, and it was a 50-acre farm, and I used to go up there on the weekends. And I was working there one weekend when this elderly Lesotho, he came walking along the fence line, and he greeted me. He said, "How bas," sort of thing. And I said, "Sambona," or whatever the word. It's been a long time. And I invited him to come into my property, and we had a chat. And he spoke English. He explained to me. I said to him, "What are you doing here? Because you're a Sotho." He said, "Oh, look, I'll tell you a story." So he told me that he had worked for Anglo-American for 36 years. 36 years in the mines. And there was a rock fall and his back was hurt. And he could no longer lift heavy things. He could no longer do the work. But didn't get 1 cent for pension. And of course, when he got back to his family, they said, look, you're an old guy, you're not able to support us anymore, and they kicked him out. He was actually just walking around trying to find a place to call home. So I actually said to him, look, you build your little kraal here in the corner, and you can be my induna. You can look after my block of land. So he said, oh, thank you so much. He was so happy. And I used to bring him mealie meal and stuff like that on a regular basis from Escort, where I and I was just shocked that Anglo-American would do that to someone who'd been working for them for 30 years. Extraordinary. So, talk about hypocritical.
I'm afraid I've accumulated quite a lot of negative things about Anglo-American over the years too. For example, you're well aware of the fact that Anglo-American is the most powerful force in Namibia, Botswana, and in some parts of Zambia too. Yeah. So, for example, up in Zambia, I was informed that under UNIP of Kenneth Kaunda, under the socialist humanism of Kenneth Kaunda, Anglo-American had a monopoly status, and they didn't bother to raise the salaries of their workers while inflation was going through the roof, and the workers at some stage striked, which was perfectly understandable, and peacefully. Unlike what the Americans call protesters, these were very peaceful protesters. And Anglo-American refused to negotiate and just called out the police, who opened fire on the protesters who were not doing anything violent. Now, that didn't make the news, I'm told by my Zambian friends, because Anglo-American owned the newspapers in Zambia too. So, interesting, that's why I think you've got people like Armand Hammer and the Rothschilds and so on, who are happy to work with socialist dictators in Soviet Union like Stalin and Castro and Mao Zedong, and of course with Mugabe and Kenneth Kaunda and Mengistu and all those people, because it's so much easier when you only have to pay off the dictator and the ruling party, and there's only one party, and you don't have to worry about free press or the safety of your workers or any of those sort of things. So it's an interesting thing. Many people think, there's on the far right you've got the capitalist, and on the far left you've got the communist, and it's not actually so. It seems to me that they work together. And the monopoly capitalist, I'm referring to monopoly capitalism separate from free enterprise, because free enterprise may support family businesses and family farms and individuals and help bring people up. But monopoly capitalism is as rapacious as communism, and it's got the same goal of having such a monopoly that you crush the little guy. So I'm afraid Anglo-American, to me, presents the unacceptable face of capitalism. And of course, capitalism, the very term capitalism, is a term coined by Karl Marx. Karl Marx spoke of capitalists. Now, I'm not a capitalist in that sense. I believe in free enterprise. Right. But free enterprise is not the same thing as rapacious, no conscience capitalism, which crushes competitors and finances Marxist revolutionaries to come to power. This does need a bit more exposition. There are people like Sutton who've written a book, Wall Street and the Bankrolling of the Bolshevik Revolution. So, yes, I think it's a shocking thing what Anglo-American did South Africa. And by the way, you're aware of Stephen Mitford Goodson. Stephen Mitford Goodson was a director of the Southern Reserve Bank. He's a whistleblower. Right. He's a good friend. We regularly had him as a guest speaker at our Reformation Society in Cape Town. Sadly, he died under very questionable circumstances 2 years ago. But Stephen Mitford Goodson wrote the book Inside the South African Reserve Bank, which was staggering, exposing the corruption on a high level. As he said, state capture in South Africa began under Jan Smuts with the instituting of the Southern Reserve Bank. And he also wrote A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind. Superb book. He also wrote The Genocide of the Boers, where he documented how the Rothschilds wanted to crush the Boer republics and gain complete control of the Transvaal and the Free State because the gold and diamonds there. Right. And he documents that there was a deliberate policy where these Rothschilds, as they had used the British Navy to support them almost as their mercenaries in the Opium War on China, when they couldn't trade with China, and so they tried to smuggle in drugs, heroin, and so on, into China. You just think of the heinousness of this and where the morals were. And when China understandably resisted opium being brought into their shores, and who wouldn't, the Royal Navy was mobilized to force the Chinese to accept the opium, that's the 1840s. Well, in 1899, the Rothschilds got the British Army to do their dirty work in genociding the Boers to gain control of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which the Rothschilds called the richest piece of real estate on earth. And in his book, Stephen Mitford Goodson's got the picture, the card, which in Christmas 1901, every British, Canadian, New Zealand, Australian soldier involved in the war in South Africa, which was 480,000 soldiers, got a hamper as a personal gift from the Rothschilds. And in this hamper, it was a very generous hamper. It had Christmas pudding, it had sweets, it had chocolates, it had hot chocolate, it had tea, it had coffee, it had tobacco, it had pipe tobacco and cigarettes and cigars, and it had a whole bunch of different things with a personal card signed by all three of the major Rothschilds. Thank you for what you're doing for us. Now, I don't know what they would have thought, but when I was on the border in Southwest Africa and in Angola, if I'd gotten a card from Harry Oppenheimer on thanking me on behalf of the Beers, I would have thought, what? I'm not here for you. What are you talking about? And so it just showed what was going on was extremely dishonest. So Stephen Mitford Goodson documented the role of Anglo-American and De Beers to this extent that, for example, as an economist, he's got a doctorate from Belgian University of Ghent and so on in economics. Stephen Mitford Goodson, his interest was economics, but because he saw what had been done in the South Reserve Bank, he then did a biography on Jan Christian Smuts, General Smuts, who had instituted the Reserve Bank, to find out why. And then he did another one on the life of Hendrik Verwoerd, who was assassinated in 1966, on the 6th of the 9th, 1966. And it was even chosen when, on the orders of Anglo-American and so on, because H.F. Verwoerd, our Prime Minister in South Africa, super popular and extremely intelligent Prime Minister, he was trying to dismantle the Southern Reserve Bank and take back control of the economy back to the Southern people. And he had also instituted a special investigation into the role of Anglo-American in subverting South Africa to the Marxists. And interesting that it took an economist like Stephen Mitford Goodson to dig out the documentation on this. And all of it started with the economics. Who brought in our Reserve Bank and who was trying to dismantle it and how he was assassinated. And then he puts in a whole lot of other footnotes next to this, saying that he was just shortly before the American president, John F. Kennedy, had been assassinated for much the same reason. And he starts to show the linking of the interference that John F. Kennedy was doing in trying to bring the American Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, which is not federal, has no reserves and is not a bank, as he pointed out, back under the American control. And he gets a public assassination in the most brutal way, just as H.F. Verwoerd said that these are basically the same kind of things, hits. And he links it also to the assassination of the Tsar and his whole family in Russia in 1918 on the 18th of July. How they're assassinated, and this was also because the Rothschilds had this vendetta against the Tsar because they would not have a Rothschild bank in Russia. And so the toppling of Russia and bringing in a communist regime, there was a high goal in the aims of the Rothschilds. Now, I've been quoting here all from the books of Stephen Mitford Goodson, the economist who once was director of the Southern Reserve Bank. Interesting, the connection, showing that, in fact, what we think is the extreme left and extreme right, it's like you've gone around the circle. Actually, they're working together.
It's a facade. Now, I want to keep on the theme of the Oppenheimers in a second. I just want to address people watching. Guys, remember to put your questions in the side chat. I have actually placed a couple of questions ready. Don't forget this painting. Beautiful, beautiful painting of a lion. There it is. Get your bid in. It's a starting price of 5,000. I think we have got a bid on it now, haven't we? Someone could just let me know. That's the detail you get. Look at that eye. Now, the winning bidder, the money will go directly to fund or help fund the operation that Isaac van Zyl is going through. Okay, now getting back to Rupert's and the Oppenheimers. Now, what I find really disturbing is their power play behind the scenes with this lockdown. And clearly they've used this to their own advantage. I mean, the funds they put up for R1 billion each or something like, it's like petty cash to them. And then a lot of that money was restricted. And now you've got Rupert, who's got a huge taxi industry, where Ramaphosa has said, look, we're going to pay you guys over R1 billion to help you out because rough under the lockdown. What influence do you think the Ruperts and the Oppenheimers have over the ANC right now, today? Lockdown in particular.
Enormous. Because, for example, the most serious crime you can commit in South Africa or Namibia or Botswana to this day is illegal diamond buying. So it's an interesting thing. If you find a diamond on your farm, it belongs to De Beers. If you are scuba diving in the Orange River or off the Atlantic coast of South Africa and you find a diamond, it belongs to De Beers. Same thing in Namibia, same thing in Botswana. All diamonds, uncut diamonds in the country, belong to De Beers. You will not get less than a 10-year sentence for trading in illicit diamonds, which is far more than you'll get for first-degree murder, by the way. And so, on average, there's no doubt that the one thing that's a constant between the old government and the new is illegal diamond buying, so-called. That any diamond anywhere in the country, if it's uncut, it belongs to De Beers. And so this is something which just shows the power that De Beers has, which transcends change of governments. You would have thought a change of government would make a big change. In some cases it does, but it doesn't seem to make much difference to companies like De Beers. Isn't that intriguing? They're happy to work with a Marxist mass-murdering thug like Mugabe. They're happy to work with a socialist dictator like Kenneth Kaunda. And they're happy to work with a whole range of different people. Some or other, they've got an ability to control them. And so it doesn't seem that the influence is good. They don't speak up for farmers being murdered and tortured. They don't speak up for the common man and common sense. But it seems that just like the lockdown regulations didn't harm the big businesses, but it crushes the family businesses, it crushes the small businesses, it crushes the middle class, and yet it enriches the ones in the massive positions, because their businesses don't get shut down and they continue to do just fine. In fact, they probably had advance warning insider trading, and so they've also diversified into producing masks and hand sanitizers and the temperature gauges that everybody, including every church and business and a hairdresser, now has got to have to put a temperature gun to a person's head when they walk in and things like that. So it's extraordinary how all of these crises, it never seems to harm or in any way adversely affect these massive, big, mega capitalists or communists, but the poor middleman and the middle class get crushed.
Well, that's self-evident. That's absolutely shocking. I just want to go back to this. We kind of got off the track a bit, but it's fascinating hearing what you have to tell us about these big companies and their involvement. Manipulating everything in South Africa. But let's get back to psychological warfare for a second, because there's some other things I'd like to ask you about that. And what is the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism?
I'm sorry, you need to repeat that sentence. I missed that, the last sentence.
Who and what is the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism?
Oh, the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a group in Western Europe, in Frankfurt, Germany, Frankfurt am Main, who were all a bunch of Marxists. Now, this included some famous names that some people may readily recognize, like Antonio Gramsci, who devised the Gramsci strategy, and Herbert Marcuse in fact, you might have heard of Marcusian. So, for example, it's an interesting thing that when Bill Clinton became president of America, now we're going back a few years, and he was asked, who's been his mentor? And he said, Antonio Gramsci had the most impact in his life. And at another stage, Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, Hillary Clinton was asked, which writer or thinker had most influence her? And she said, Herbert Marcuse. Okay, now, they were both Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism. So the Frankfurt School were Marxists of a wide range, coalesced in Frankfurt, but they represent from all over Europe. So, for example, Antonio Gramsci was founder and head of the Italian Communist Party. Now, the Frankfurt School came to the conclusion that it was impossible to replicate the Bolshevik Revolution because the First World War and the economic destabilization and military collapse of Russia presented a unique opportunity, and Lenin got lucky, basically. We cannot expect a Bolshevik revolution to occur in any country in Europe because, they said, Europe's too Christian. And so Antonio Gramsci came out with what's been called either the termite strategy or the Gramsci strategy. So what he said is, we will not be able to have a Bolshevik revolution in any Western country. Western countries are too Christian, too strong economically, militarily, and every other way. What we need is a long view. It's going to take generations, but we need to work like termites within the structure, eating out the heart of Western institutions. And our long march through the institutions of the West, we need to rot out the insides of the pillars. So just as you could imagine a wooden building, when you've hollowed out the pillars, at a certain point, even if they put new coats of paint on regularly and so on, the entire structure will collapse at a certain point if you hollow out the insides. And so Antonio Gramsci said, what we need to do is get the West to think about every problem without reference to God or the Bible or Jesus Christ in particular. We must get the West to think not only in a non-Christian way, but in an anti-Christian way. We need to Marxize the inner man. That was his term, Marxize the inner man. And to do this, we'll have to do it through the arts and sciences. And we'll have to, he said, there's 5 culture-carrying institutions that you have to infiltrate to subvert Western society, to take over Western society. These are the 5 culture-carrying, culture-transforming institutions. Education. That's a thumb. That's the most important. Education. Entertainment. News media, religious institutions, and finally, political institutions. Although, to be honest, the political institutions are the least important because once you've got the educational institutions, the philosophy of government in one generation will become the philosophy of the classroom in one generation will become the philosophy of government in the next generation. And entertainment influences a lot of people because while people are laughing and being entertained, they don't realize that they can be being subverted in their minds and be acclimatized to accept things they wouldn't have accepted before. And the news media telling people all the news that's fit to print without fear or favor, that with, let's face it, most news today is not news at all, it's views. And I think you can refer to the BBC as the Bolshevik Broadcasting Corporation, the CNN as the Clinton News Network, and Time Magazine as Slime Magazine, and Newsweek as Newspeak, and US News and World Report as Useless News and World Report, and Sunday Times as Sunday Crimes. Media today is now run in many cases by prostitutes, and they are prostituting the journalistic profession for Marxism. Now, here's the interesting thing. Once Antonio Gramsci had presented this termite strategy, or the Gramsci strategy as it became known, and Herbert Marcuse added, we need to use foul language, obscenity, vulgarity, blasphemy as verbal grenades against bourgeois Christian society. And so in order to undermine Christianity, we need to introduce into the theater and to art obscenity, blasphemy, and vulgarity in order to subvert Western Christian culture. And the best way to turn a generation against their parents' Christianity is to get them involved in sexual immorality. So we've got to get them sex-crazed, sex-obsessed, sex mad, and we've got to push the envelope till they accept nudity, perversion, and the whole lot. And he even saw back in the 1930s, we need to push it all the way through to transgenderism. In fact, they were talking about that even 1920s, because in 1920s, in Weimar, Germany, which was dominated by the Frankfurt School of Marxists, they actually had 800 brothels in Berlin. They had 800 cabarets, brothels, sexually oriented business just in Berlin. And what absolutely outraged so many people, of course, was in many cases widows of soldiers who died in the war, because 2 million German soldiers had died in the First World War. And the bankers had taken over people's entire estates and pushed widows and orphans into the streets. And there were widows of soldiers who were forced to prostitution in one form or another to keep their children alive under the Weimar Republic in Germany. And you can imagine what this did, the resentment. And they did the first human sex change in Berlin. And it was a homosexual doctor whose patient died under the knife, mind you. So it wasn't successful. But the first actual attempt at a sex change operation was done in the 1920s, I think 1928, in Weimar, Berlin. This is all part of the Weimar Republic, was where the Frankfurt School was doing their test. Now, not surprisingly, in 1933, everyone in the Frankfurt School immigrated for obvious reasons, because the nationalists gained control and they knew that their days had come to an end there. And they moved to America mostly, and they moved into Columbia University and Harvard and Hollywood. And from the first Comintern in 1921, Communist International, it was already determined by Joseph Stalin that the number one target has to be films, and particularly Hollywood. Now, Hollywood in 1921 was still just getting going, really. In fact, as they said, we were the only party in town, which is a pun. I mean, they were the only political party in town. They were the only party in Hollywood. And so the communists got in at the ground floor, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and the whole lot, they ate the heart out of it. And there was a lot of immorality being pushed originally in the films, which was rolled back in 1930s as they brought in the Hayes Act and self-regulation, and they had the Motion Picture Production Code. But in 1968, I think they abandoned all that, and they went full blast into every kind of immorality. And you could see the real Hollywood, which before was more subversive, but then became more blatant, because they saw that the opportunity had come to that where they could do this. So this is where you can see the Psy-War. Stalin saw the importance of the cinema, and he recognized we must turn the cinemas into the new churches. And just as the churches are the bastion of Christianity in the West, we'll turn the churches into bastions for secular humanism, communism, evolutionism, social Darwinism, cultural Marxism. So what the Frankfurt School did is they said, Karl Marx was talking economics. Trouble is, economics takes a long time to bring about the revolution that we need. And in fact, all of Karl Marx's theories failed to be fulfilled in Russia, because Karl Marx had economically predicted that the first country to go communist would be Great Britain, because Great Britain was the most industrialized, the most industrially advanced. And he thought Britain probably first, Germany probably second, France maybe third, would go communist. And in fact, the most backward country, the country that Karl Marx had dismissed, and Karl Marx dismissed the Slavs as backward and ethnic trash. And funny how they started to idolize Karl Marx and put up thousands of monuments to him, because Karl Marx despised the Slavs. And according to Marxist ideology, Russia was so backward, they weren't ready for communism. Communism's meant to develop out of the highest stage of capitalism, that the next stage is they'd move into communism. That's Marxism. So, of course, Leninism changed that to, we need violent revolution. But now the Gramsci strategy and the Marcusian strategy of the cultural Marxists of the Frankfurt School was, that's not going to work. The economics of Marx isn't going to work. The violent revolution of Lenin's not going to work. We need cultural Marxism to subvert the society from within, to rot the institutions of the West, to prepare it. And they said this will take generations. But ultimately, we will have the population of the West not only thinking in a non-Christian mind, but an anti-Christian mind by taking over education, entertainment, news media. And so that is cultural Marxism. And that is the Frankfurt School.
Well, I have to say that they've achieved their objective. I was on a live stream yesterday, Australian time. A lady who was walking down the street in the suburbs of Melbourne had a placard which said, "All lives matter." And she was asking people whether they agreed with her God. The thing that really struck me, and you can see this live stream, it's actually on my channel. The thing that really struck me is that all the people who are probably 50 years and older would say, yes, you're right, all lives matter. And there were these people who were in their 20s who were saying, no, black lives matter, only black lives matter. And then they would try and explain themselves. But there was this cultural divide between the elderly who would say, yes, all lives matter, and the youth who obviously had gone through an education process where they'd been in. And if we have a look at what's happening in America today, you know, Black Lives Matter and all these, they call them protests, I call them riots. It's quite extraordinary. Do you think America's approaching a stage where there's going to be some kind of, basically a civil war? What's going on right now?
I'd say they're already in it. In fact, back in the 1990s, you had James Dobson writing books like War on the Children, where he said America's in a civil war now. Now he's talking about the 1990s, and that it is a war of values, it's a war of morals, it's a war, it's a battle for the family, it's a battle for marriage, it's a battle for hearts and minds and lives and for eternity. It's a battle for civilization. And I would say with the riots and violence in the streets, let's face it, if they succeed in this revolution, God forbid, but if they succeed, they will treat the date when George Floyd died and the place where he died and the Minneapolis riots as like the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789, like Soweto Day, 16th of June, South Africa, 1976. They'll treat it as something that'll build up the mythology of the new religion of the revolution. And this is how revolutions are made. And in fact, when you look at the actual facts of the French Revolution, reading books like Otto Scott's Robespierre, Inside the French Revolution, and you read, I remember reading this book in just about 2 or 3 days, and it's a big book, but I was just intrigued because as I read Otto Scott describing what led up to the French Revolution, 1789, it was like I was reading what I'd lived through in Rhodesia, South Africa, and the way that revolutionaries worked, and it was like, this is incredible. We're talking about 200 years ago, and yet it's so relevant that the human nature and the communist strategy has not changed. And there's so much you can learn from history. And again, with the Bolshevik Revolution, I've just been reading about the Bolshevik Revolution over the last few days because I recognize what's going on in America is replicating that. And it's extraordinary, the similarities. I'd say we're already in a revolution, and I'm sure the revolutionaries believe this is the beginning of the revolution. And it's got all the hallmarks of it. Yeah. And BLM, Black Lives Matter, or as some people say, BLM stands for Baal, Lucifer, and Moloch. And like it's a religious cult. Black Lives Matter, the movement, is actually a religious cult. And I say cult carefully because it's not just a religion, it's a cult. A cult is distinguished from a normal religion in that a cult claims that they are exclusive and you cannot be saved unless you believe and are part of their movement. So, we know there's some cults where they claim they're the only way of salvation. Of course, a denomination is meant to be recognizing we're only a denomination of the broader Church of Christ, for example, and
right.
And any true Christian church recognizes we are not the whole Church of Christ. We're only a small part of it, and there are many manifestations of the Church of Christ. That's the opposite of a cult. But a cult says you cannot be saved unless you do as we say, and you say what we say you've got to say. And so BLM says you must kneel, and you must apologize for being a straight white male, because straight white male is original sin. Now, if you're a straight white female, 2 strikes against you. If you're straight black male, 2 strikes against you. If you are a straight white male, 3 strikes against you. Irredeemable, basically. Now, there's no atonement, there's no forgiveness, there's no redemption in Black Lives Matter. But blood is shed, and glass is shattered, and monuments are defaced, or even removed, preferably, and destroyed. And there's rituals, public rituals. You must have public ceremonies where people must kneel and confess and apologize, or clean feet, or brush boots, or kiss boots, or whatever it is. And this is all the hallmarks of a religious cult. Yeah. And just the fact that, for example, as a Christian, I believe I bow before God and God alone. I confess my sins to God and to God alone. I'm a Protestant. I don't believe in confessing my sins to others. And of course, if you have personally offended an individual, a personal apology to that individual is one thing. But why should anyone apologize to strangers for something they never did? To someone that isn't even a person you're talking to. It's not relevant. But this is how religions work, and this is how cults work. And speaking about Black Lives Matter, I think like all mobs, there's nothing they respect more than strength. There's nothing they despise more than weakness. And what the Americans are doing is cultivating this cult, this dangerous revolutionary religious cult, to a point where it's going to be very hard to put it back again. Because historically, when you have people rioting and looting, historically, the only way you could restore respect for life and property was to shoot the looters. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. That's the way it's been. Napoleon Bonaparte was a young lieutenant when he witnessed the mob storming the palace of King Louis XVI, and he said he wondered, why did the king not order his men to open fire? Why did he order his men not to fire? And he saw the entire Swiss Guard murdered to the man. And of course, the king and his family were all murdered ultimately too, and ceremonially on the guillotine in the front of everyone. So he looked at this, and young Napoleon Bonaparte determined, if I ever face a mob, I will turn the artillery on them. I will give them the whiff of grape shot. And by that he meant artillery on the mob. He said there's no innocent person in the mob. Mobs are murderous. You cannot reason with a mob. Now, it was 6 years later, October 1795, when Napoleon Bonaparte faced a mob in Paris, and he turned the cannon on them. He gave them the whiff of grape shot. That led to him becoming part of the Directorate, Triumvirate III, who ruled France, because he brought stability in a revolutionary situation, and he later became emperor. Now, what Napoleon said is, anarchy in the street leads to tyranny. And it's true. And that's its aim. Vladimir Lenin said, do not underestimate the value of constructive chaos. Now, here you've got to understand social Darwinism. Remember, atheists, communists, revolutionaries are Darwinists. In fact, remember, Karl Marx wanted to dedicate his Das Kapital to Charles Darwin, who thought this is not going to be good PR and refused the offer. But a communist is actually a social Darwinist. And just as Darwin has said that order came out of chaos, and once there was nothing and then there was something, that something became everything, and basically an explosion created everything. So from a social Darwinist point of view, if you can just burn down enough things and blow up enough things, utopia, paradise will result. And it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view if you can actually follow the evolutionary ways of thinking. This is social Darwinism. And those kids on the street are obviously the result of years of indoctrination, and obviously they've been brainwashed, but they honestly, sincerely believe, and I know because I deal with communists, I've been evangelizing communists and debating and discussing with them for decades. They really believe that what they're doing is morally defensible. In fact, it's as pure and as honorable as could ever be done, because it's going to bring about a better world. And so they believe it doesn't matter how many lives you smash, how many innocent people you kill, it's all for the greater good, it's for the cause, because it's going to bring about world communism, it's going to bring about a classless world society. And so I think they as passionately believe in this religious cult, this revolutionary cult, as it's possible to believe. I think many of them are very sincere. Of course, you've got your charlatans who are just in it for the looting and maybe murder and mayhem that they enjoy. But I think there are many real, sincere revolutionaries who absolutely convinced that even while they're destroying your life, cursing you, causing injury, they really believe that what they're doing is not just morally defensible, it is exemplary, because they've got all the passion of a Marxist revolutionary. And that's why I call it's a religious cult. Social Darwinism, blow up and burn down enough things and paradise will result.
Amazing. Oh, keep you on that theme. That famous book by George Orwell, where he warned us in his novel 1984 of the thought times, fake news, all these different things. Do you want to just about that?
Yes, it's absolutely extraordinary. This was one of my set work books at school in Rhodesia, Animal Farm and 1984, both by George Orwell.
Right.
And George Orwell, first and foremost, bear in mind, he was a policeman in the British Empire in Burma. He was an editor of a newspaper. He was a dedicated communist. He went to the Soviet Union. He saw the workers' paradise under Stalin. He was a propagandist in the British Department of Propaganda during the Second World War. So that's his background. George Orwell in 1948 saw the future. I mean, he saw the trends, where things are going.
Right.
And as an ex-communist, disillusioned with communism, he wrote Animal Farm as a satire, political satire, where the pigs are the politicians and 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and all that. And all animals equal, but some animals more equal than others. But in 1984, he gives a much darker, more pessimistic view of the future. And here we get George Orwell warning us of thought police punishing thought crimes. And I remember as a student at school in Rhodesia thinking, that's not possible. It's never could that happen. I mean, thought crimes, how can you have a thought crime? How can we have thought police? And yet that's what we've got right now. And not only that, but they had 2-minute hates during news in the evening when people would pour out their hate and just pour out their venom against some real or imagined enemy. But then you'd have hate weeks. And during the hate weeks, and this is what we're experiencing, we're having a hate week or 2 weeks. I've seen this in Cape Town. Roads must fall, fees must fall, monuments must fall, things like this.
Yeah.
History must fall, science must fall. And, well, right now in America, it's history must fall and all of that. And this is hate week or hate 2 weeks or hate month, whatever it is. But he foresaw this need that they would channel the frustration and anger that people should feel against those who are really exploiting them and lying to them and destroying their finances and their futures. But it's channeled towards a real or imagined enemy with obviously a lot of exaggerations on, but to channel their hate. You just think, for example, here in South Africa, we have a government who is looting 32% of the gross domestic product every year in corruption, according to the African Union's task force on corruption. We've got a government which can't keep the lights on, can't provide enough water, where things are falling apart on every level. And yet they can convince the people regularly that if you could just tear down a statue of Cecil John Rhodes or of Jan van Riebeeck died over 300 years ago. And you think that is the cause of your problems right now from a government that's corrupt. So interesting things that here you've got in America, all kinds of problems. The people get locked down, their businesses get destroyed, their occupations get destroyed, commit economic suicide for a virus. And next thing is, if you can just pull down these statues of the founder of the nation and things like this, Columbus must go, Washington must go, Thomas Jefferson must go, Theodore Roosevelt, what did he do wrong? And it's just on and on and on. Most of these kids in the street don't have any idea of the significance of that history, of that monument, of that marker, but they are somehow, obviously, just like in 1984, ENGSOC, or the English Socialist Party, has mobilized the hate crimes. So in 1984, George Orwell also spoke about the thought police getting rid of critics. So how would they get rid of these critics? They would make them unpersons. Interesting how today you can be unfriended.
Oh, really?
You make a person an unperson, and then he would be vaporized, and he would disappear down the memory hole. So they would literally write out people out of history, out of real life and so on, just like Stalin got rid of Beria and Yaboko and Bakurin and all. Trotsky got literally axed. I mean, the hero of the revolution. He is like Snowball in Animal Farm, and he gets literally hounded out, and he gets axed in Mexico City by the NKVD. This sort of thing. And I mean, Stalin was a nothing. Stalin was not part of the original revolution. Stalin was not part of the beginning like Trotsky was. And Trotsky, who was the main hero of the revolution, the leader of the Red Army, if you can call it that heroic, but from their perspective, he gets kicked out, exiled, and later murdered by Stalin. And Stalin, who wasn't even part of the original revolution, becomes the perfect leader, sort of like as you see in Animal Farm Napoleon. So they then get vaporized. They get cut out, painted out of literally other pictures, other textbooks, other history, until they don't exist anymore. And the monuments get pulled down and so on. And at the end of the book, George Orwell writes about every monument has been changed. Every street name has been changed. The past has been rewritten. And history disappears until all you're left with is a continual present in which the party is always right. And that brings one to the mind of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, We Never Make Mistakes. Now, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was quoting from a communist who said, we never make mistakes. And to his dying day, Trotsky said he believes the party is always right. Now, even though he'd been banned by the party, exiled by the party, and was murdered by the party just a few years later, he said he died in the unshakable faith in the Communist Party, because, you see, it is a religion. And as far as they're concerned, the party isn't a place of God. The party is always right. The party cannot make mistakes. The party is infallible, basically. They've taken down God. Who's in the place of God? The party.
Right.
And after a while, it's the party leader. So it starts off with the people are God, and then the party are God, and it ends up with the party leader is God.
That's like North Korea.
That is idolatry.
That's like North Korea, right?
That is communism, but that's also a secular humanism led to its ultimate conclusion, because it becomes idolatry, because it goes from we are God to I am God, basically, ultimately, and me, myself, and I, existentialism. This is, if people will not put God in the first place, as we should, ultimately we put man in the first place, and many end up putting themselves in the first place. A place that should be for God alone.
I just want to address my chat for a second. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Just subscribe button and ring the bell to get the updates. Painting, I believe we got a bid of 6,000 Rand for it now. It's absolutely gorgeous. In the eye, it's just absolutely stunning. Look at that detail. Guys, please don't hesitate to put in. The money goes to help Isaac, his operation. Now, there's one more question I want to ask you, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start taking the questions that I've copied from people in the side chat, so that they'll be following very shortly. They'll be following in the actual order that they were actually posted, so that first come, first served, if I can put it that way. Okay, now the final question I want to ask you about specifically psychological warfare is, what are the antidotes to the Psyops? Gaslighting, guilt manipulation, Stockholm syndrome, cultural Marxism, indoctrination, all those things. Just explain those to us, the antidotes.
Yes, now I've been a missionary now for over 40 years, 38 years to the persecuted church through Frontline Fellowship. And in this work, of course, I've had to look at some pretty ugly things. I've walked in the killing fields of Mozambique. I've documented massacres, burning of Bibles, crucifying of pastors, hideous things. I've been under fire, I've been captured, I've been in prison, and I've had to report on some pretty heinous things, like walking through churches filled with corpses in Rwanda, documenting the Holocaust in Rwanda, and piles and piles and piles of dead bodies up to waist high in some places. So you can imagine, in a situation like this, how do you keep your sanity, and how do you keep positive so that you can keep going. Because if we just focused on the evil that men do, in the name of bringing about utopia and justice and freedom, mind you, it's amazing what evils are done in the names of justice. So how do we keep sane, and how do we, in a world of lies, manage to keep our sanity and have a positive response to it? So George Orwell again said that to tell the truth is a revolutionary act. In an age of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. And the further people drift from the truth, the more they will hate those who speak the truth. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was one of the greatest Russian authors and philosophers of the 20th century, spent years in Stalin's communist concentration camps. He gave the word gulag to the dictionary to describe the communist concentration camp system, with over 1,200 concentration camps, which chewed up the lives of 50 million Russians. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "The lie is the pillar of the state." And the lie has become the pillar of the entire communist state. And so he said, "Let your credo be thus: let the lie come, but not through me. I will not advance the lie." And so he said we couldn't do much to fight the lie at some stages, but we could at least determine not to advance it, not to repeat it, not to promote it. And honestly, as somebody who was brought up in Rhodesia, lived through 3 revolutions, gone through 8 wars, and traveled in 42 countries, I have seen the lie all over the place. And a lot of things that I used to believe, because I watched the Hollywood films and I read the textbooks, and a lot of things I used to believe, I don't believe anymore. There's nothing like facts to ruin a good story, and a Hollywood narrative and a media narrative. And working in many of these countries, Sudan, Congo, Nigeria, and so on, going behind the Iron Curtain, meeting the people behind the Iron Curtain, meeting many of these heroes of the faith who stood firm for decades under communist persecution, or people who now are standing firm in the Muslim Middle East under hideous persecution. It's putting some steel in my backbones and fire in my belly. Determination that I will not bow, I will not bend, I will not burn, I will not in any way compromise with the lie. And I'm afraid Hollywood and secular humanist New World Order is just riddled with lies, built on lies, and they are destroying our society through lies. So the first thing is the truth. You will know the truth, and truth will set you free. Getting back to the Bible is the first most important solid rock foundation needed in the storms of life, obviously. Secondly, getting back to examples of excellence in history. Now, we know that there are those who are producing books and films and so on to pull down civilization, break it down. We need to go back to those classic books that built up civilization. So, for example, in my family, we used quite a bit of our lockdown going back to the great classics of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens, and many of these really great classics, Leo Tolstoy, and managing to reread many of the phenomenal great classic books that are examples of excellence. And as the scripture says, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are excellent and of good report, meditate in such things. And so it's so important to me that I must, in the course of my work, I must sometimes look at some ugly things and I must report it. And I have. I've researched and written the books Holocaust in Rwanda, Faith and Defiance Sudan, In the Killing Fields of Mozambique, Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam. I've had to document some pretty horrible things, but I don't enjoy doing that. But I must expose the evil to be fair to the memory of those who've suffered, and many of them have asked me to please be our ambassador, speak up for us. And so to speak up for the persecuted church is important. But that's not enough, because that's actually soul-destroying in some ways. And so I've put a lot of my life and energy into promoting the good. So I've looked at great examples of excellence in history. And even in these books, I've tried to focus on the examples of resilience and courage and perseverance, and given a face and a picture and a name of people who stood and did not bow. And I think that's seriously important. Reporting back on, for example, the man, the evangelist in the Nuba Mountains, who had both his feet chopped off, axed off at the ankles, and yet is still walking on his knees or riding on a donkey to take the gospel to his neighbors, despite the Arab National Islamic Front of Sudan having axed off his feet, because he wouldn't allow the inconvenience of not having feet keep him from proclaiming the gospel. Trying to focus on these examples. So I've also produced books, history books, Greatest Century of Reformation, 16 biographies, well illustrated with stories, character studies of 16 greatest reformers of the 16th century. The Greatest Century of Reformation, and then was followed with Greatest Century of Missions, 19 great missionaries of the 19th century. And Victorious Christians Changed the World, 32 biographies going from the 2nd century through to the 20th century, character studies that help you to understand history from personality character studies, but all examples of excellence. We're talking about the Perpetuers, the David Livingstons, the Mary Slessors.
Peter, where can people buy your books or go and look at your books? Yes,
so our book ministry, this month we're celebrating 25 years of Christian Liberty Books. It's a book ministry that's in our mission house. It's a not-for-profit mission ministry. ChristianLibertyBooks.co.za. Admin at ChristianLibertyBooks.co.za is the email. www.ChristianLibertyBooks.co.za is the website. And 29 of our books are now ebooks as well. We've actually got 6,000 titles in our bookshop. Most of those are to do with home education. We are a major home education provider in South Africa, but I've written 70 books and manuals, 70, over the years, and I've got quite a few in the pipeline that we're still working on now. One of them I've been working for many years, which is Frontline, Behind Enemy Lines for Christ, which is basically my biography, but the most exciting parts of it, of behind the lines, in the war zones and in prison and all of that, and under fire. So that one I hope to have out before the end of this year. ChristianLibertyBooks.co.za.
Fantastic. Now, before we take I present these questions, something I need to get an update on. We've been quite involved with the various secessionist groups and other parties and organizations in largely the Cape. Now, you're acting as like a facilitator. Is there anything you can share with people as to how that's going and what's happening in that area?
I certainly can. In fact, just today, we've produced a handbook for Cape independence, which this has got a really exciting whole series of presentations. So this whole manual has been put together, name of the Cape Independence Forum. So I've had the opportunity over the last several months since we spoke last, to get together different groups and individuals who are committed to self-determination, secession, independence, freedom, and we've managed to talk together, sometimes around a bonfire and a braai, other times through lockdown, through Zoom lens. Just this last weekend, I went out to Zuidland, which is an independence group that's up in the west coast, drove about 170 kilometers north, to a community where they're traveling from all over, from Transvaal and so on, and they are creating their own independent, defendable, self-sustainable area. So that's USAF, and they are that's Rodney and Brian are working on that, and so managed to consult with them. Just 3 weeks ago, I met with 12 Muslim community leaders in Athlone, and they came from as far as Drakenstein and Paul, and they wanted me specifically to guide them on independence. I've had a lot of radio programs promoting Cape Independence, and so there's a whole range of groups, from the Cape Independence Action Group, the Cape Party, Cape Exit, tremendous interest, and more or less there's better cooperation than before. Although not everyone is on board yet. There's other groups I'm still trying to get fully involved. We've had some of the Sovereign State of Good Hope involved, but not enough. I've tried to be getting King Kubaha Cornelius involved, unsuccessfully so far. There's the Cape Coloured Congress, which I'm trying to get involved as well. They seem interested, but we haven't got them part of the forum yet. So there is progress, and I've produced a number of videos, audios, PowerPoints, and articles on secession in the Bible and history, And I witnessed to successful secessions where I give my testimonies of what I've seen and witnessed everywhere from Croatia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sudan, and so on. And then there's also a case for Cape independence. And so I've got 3 videos, 3 audios, 3 PowerPoints on those aspects, which is to help inspire and guide people. And now, of course, we've got this manual, which
Where did
we
people
trust
get
is
that?
going to...
How can people get
Well,
that?
we're putting it online right now. It's actually right now already just been uploaded tonight onto our www.frontlinemissionsa.org website. So frontlinemissionsa.org. It's a free PDF book. So
Fantastic.
it's an ebook, but it's PDF format, so people can print it out for themselves or read it online, share it electronically. So it's this is just one of our tools. We've also got links to the audios, videos, and PowerPoints on our frontlinemissionsa.org website on secession. And in here we'll have, for example, a whole lot of the, and we're still adding the key contacts from the Cape Party, the Cape Exit, the different advocacy groups, and the Facebook pages and websites, and we're going to expand on that. Of course, this is going to be a work in progress. While it's got quite a lot here, including the roadmap to independence, which has been put together by Des Palm, who I think you had on not that long ago.
Yeah.
So that's also part of this handbook, and hopefully this handbook will grow. At the moment, it's 50-something pages, A4 pages, but we will add in more context, more addresses as more people come into the Cape Independence Forum, but it's a start.
Now, I just have to say that that's so exciting, and congratulations. I just knew you could get the now, I'm going to start putting questions to you, Peter, that have come from the side chat. Now, Erica has asked, what's the solution to our country's problem?
By our country, is she talking about South Africa, or is she talking about Australia, or
South
generally?
Africa.
Well, plainly, the centralized system doesn't work. And we can see in the Bible, there are those who go for the Babylonian, Tower of Babel, pyramid, Nineveh, top-down, centralized structure. And today we've got the globalists and, of course, the central planners. Communism is an extreme version of that. That's a failure. That's not biblical. That's not our way. The biblical way is decentralization. Just as the state of Israel was decentralized into 12 different geographic, cultural areas, the 12 tribes and so on. And I believe that the only solution to the mess we've got today, which is the multicultural, interfaith, globalist centralization, as seen in South Africa also by the Unicity. There's a lot of things Nelson Mandela did wrong, but the Unicities are probably the most destructive of all, because what the basic building block of society is a municipality. So our goal is to bring all the power back to the local municipality, and by municipality we mean a real municipality, a genuine community, ethno-linguistic people group of a shared faith in the area. So Paro runs Paro, Rondebosch runs Rondebosch, Mitchell's Plain runs Mitchell's Plain, Athlone runs Athlone, Bonteheuwel runs Bonteheuwel, Boerkop can be run by Boerkop, and so on. And no Unicity and no central planners from Pretoria or Wuhan or Beijing or New York telling us what to do and locking everyone down. So decentralization is the key. Now, to me, the only way this can really work, like our friends in USAF who are saying they're moving to community, setting up from scratch a community where the community protects itself, provides for itself, is off-grid, doesn't depend on the state for anything, and they make their own life. Now, that's one extreme way of doing it, but it's a very effective way. It's hard. It's like the pioneers getting in their wagons and heading off like the Voortrekkers, but they are saying, we're not asking for independence, we're taking it, and good for them, and they're making progress. But most of us are in communities where we have our buildings ready, and we've got the thugs coming around demanding rates and taxes for no services, and we've got to pay a fortune for nothing from a government who hates us and wants to steal everything. So what we believe is critical is we either go down with the SA Titanic or we launch out our own independent lifeboat, secession. And in secession, how do we make sure that an independent Western Cape doesn't go the same way as the rest of South Africa? Well, by giving the power down to the local municipality. In the local municipality, And by that we mean homeowners and ratepayers. The people who pay for the facilities in that community are the ones who should vote. It cannot be that transients and others in the areas or squatters can vote on what to do in a municipality with money that others, you've put your investment. As Paul Kruger of the Transvaal said about the Uitlanders, he said, if you are walking along the side of the road with your family and I come in my Ossewa, my ox wagon, and I offer you a lift, you do not then have the right to say there's more of us than there's of you. We are voting to take over your wagon and all that's in it. And he said, you're welcome as our guest, but don't try and take our country. And so I think this is the key thing, is the municipality must control municipal police. And in fact, there should be no national police and there should be no provincial police. It should be a municipal police. The police come from the community, protect the community, and are answerable to the community, paid by the community. And that community is controlled by the ratepayers and the homeowners. This will provide stability. This will stop corruption, because in your community, you know the people. I remember when I knew the mayor, he went to our church. We knew the town councillors. My children knew their children. When you are a genuine community, you don't get the corruption like you can have now with uni-cities and centralized situation. So this is absolutely critical, like Switzerland, where they make the canton, decentralization. And of course, taking the money out of their hands by abolishing all the taxes and going just to TEAL, Total Economic Activity Levy of 1% deduction from bank transactions, and that's it. GST, VAT abolished, no need for revenue service and so on and so forth. We need to create tax havens, bring in jobs. So we do have solutions, and they are fresh, workable solutions based on examples of excellence, such as in Switzerland, in Singapore. We don't want to follow examples of failure, follow in the footsteps of failure, Soviet Union, Cuba, Zimbabwe. We want examples of excellence. So I think that's why the independence movements are really dynamic, cutting edge, solution focused, future focused, practical, and there is hope for this country. And that's why I and my entire extended family, we're living here, we're in the Cape, we're committed, we're staying, and we're wanting to build a better future. We're not going to let these communists destroy our country around us.
Right. Now, Ben Hashem asks, a time will come where minorities will have no choice but to unite. How do you negotiate with a snake that suffocates you? And before you answer that question, I've got to tell you, I'm actually talking on a live stream on Friday night with the leader of the Cape Party. So that's going to be an interesting discussion. All right.
Jack Miller.
Yeah.
Good man. Excellent. Glad you got him on. Very good man. So the question is, how do you negotiate with a snake? Well, you cannot. And as the people in USAF said, who I was with over this weekend up the West Coast, they said, we're not asking for independence, we're taking it. We're not asking anything from the government, we just want to be left alone. We will provide our own electricity, we'll provide our own water, we provide our own everything, our own food. We don't need the government, we don't want the government. And that's, of course, what the Great Trek did. They had enough of British government interference and taking their taxes, not providing any protection, always taking the side of the cattle thieves and so on. And they just said, we're out of here, we're doing our own thing. And so, to a large extent, some of the most successful countries in the world have grown out of secession, as we've noticed in Switzerland, United States of America, right. Norway, I mean, all grown out of secession, Singapore. So we believe that you cannot negotiate, in a sense, with a Marxist revolutionary who wants to destroy you. There's nothing they respect more than strength. There's nothing they despise more than weakness. We need to be strong, firm, polite, but we need to have a plan. We need to work on this plan. And so, for example, if I look at my friends in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they worked for independence and they declared independence years before the Soviet Union recognized and actually withdrew their troops. They actually physically started becoming independent. And so to me, for example, I've pulled my children out of the state schools decades ago. I've disconnected from Southern television a long time ago. We're independent-minded. We are not opening ourselves up to the brainwashing of the other side. And so we are building up the situation where we are our own defense. We're in our own communities. We have a mutually defensive and providing system. We care for people who are suffering and who are needy within our communities, and we are taking responsibility for our community. We're cleaning up our community, we repairing, restoring, building, and we are protecting our communities. This is what's needed, regaining the sense of community. And you can't negotiate with a snake. You've got to be ready to just tell them the way it is, and if they resist, you've got to defend yourself. This is the only way it can work. Marxists understand only one possible answer, and that's strength. We have to resist them.
Right. Okay. Now Gideon Breet has asked. Please ask him Please ask Peter what he thinks is going to happen to South Africa in the next 2 years. Would love to hear his point of view.
Prediction's very hard, especially about the future. Who could have seen this coronavirus, this lockdown, unprecedented? There are things that come along that are unprecedented. We don't know the future, but God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. We need to be faithful to God. We need to do what is right. We need to plan for the best, and we need to prepare for the worst. We need to have contingency plans. We need to be positive and future focused, but we mustn't be shaken by strange things coming along like this lockdown. Now, I've lived all 60 years of my life in Africa, born in Africa, bred in Africa, raised through the wars in Rhodesia, and I've known wars and revolutions and threats and dangers for as long as I've been alive. To me, it's the normal environment in which I live. And so I've learned that there's a lot of things I couldn't have seen. I would never have foreseen South Africa from a position of strength, negotiating away its country into the hands of Marxist revolutionaries that we had defeated in the battlefield. I couldn't have foreseen it, but we didn't stop. And we didn't stop doing what's right. And we've had to be flexible and adaptable. And my friends in Eastern Europe, I was ministering to Persecuted Church, helped me to make the transition. They said to me in 1993, as we were heading into this, they said, Peter, whatever you do, don't disappear into the shadows, or you will just disappear. Your only protection against the Marxists killing or retiring you is prominent. So he said, speak up loudly. That's why people like Richard Vormbrandt and Nick Gogetsa survived, and George Vins, and also Alexander Solzhenitsyn and so on. Said, publicity can keep you alive. Be bold, be public, make your stand, do not back down, because you know what Marxists do. And so right from the beginning, we didn't stall, we didn't pause, we accelerated through the changes, every change, whether it's Y2K, and people will come up with all kinds of panics. But as a Christian, you can never respond to the challenges by fear or by retreating from the battlefield. And I just look at the crisis in America right now with all these riots and so on. And where are the leaders? Political, community, religious, AWOL, deserting, fleeing from the fight. In some cases, they've defected to the enemy and they've joined the other side. And I've seen a lot of this treachery over the years too. There's friends of mine that I would have thought were as patriotic South Africans as me, who ended up being praise singers for the ANC and speaking about Mandela like he's our savior. So there are those who in a time of crisis fold and are, but we cannot be like that. We cannot take our examples from others. We've got to take our example from Scripture, from the Lord, from examples of excellence in history, and we've got to be bold and brave and biblical, and we've got to be practical and compassionate. And so one of the things I do in all these situations as we go in the future, and let's face it, we're heading in a time of increasing lawlessness. We're heading in a time of economic decay. How can it be otherwise? We've just been committing economic suicide with this insane lockdown of a virus. And when you look at the violence in America and the fact they were screaming expropriation without compensation in South Africa 2.5 years ago. Now, we've weathered this 2.5 years of expropriation without compensation threat over our heads like the sword of Damocles. But we've been fighting it from the beginning, from February 2017, when they started this whole thing of we're going to expropriate without compensation. 2018, I've been fighting it in every way, publishing videos, audios, public meetings, in Parliament, protesting them. And I think we've thrown spanners in their works. So not everything works according to their plans. They said that we're going to expropriate farms by August 2018. Well, we've defected them by resistance. And this is the thing. So what do I see in the future? I foresee the economic collapse of South Africa. I foresee the breakup of the South African state. I foresee secession for the Kingdom of Zululand and the Cape of Good Hope, and a whole lot of others of this empire are going to break up, like Yugoslavia broke up into Slovakia, Macedonia, Slovenia, Croatia, and so on. I do believe that we're going to see the balkanization of South Africa into more coherent, logical pieces, because the South Africa as it stands now is a product of the British Empire and the Rothschilds' 1910 Union of South Africa. We weren't given a referendum. We weren't given a choice. So R.W. Johnson, a British economist, wrote the book, How Long Will South Africa Survive?
Right.
5 years ago. And he predicted that central government's going to fail. They're going to collapse economically. They won't be able to keep the lights on. They won't be able to pay the bills. And there'll be no motivation for states like Western Cape to stay in, and they're going to secede. And he then moved his whole family to the Western Cape, and he now lives somewhere in Bloberg or Table View area. So interesting that there's an economist from Britain who foresaw the breakup of South Africa and Western Cape breaking away, and then he moved his family here. That's what I see. I see basically the failure of the communist state in South Africa, economic failure in every other way, which we're already seeing. And I foresee, for self-defense and self-preservation reasons, sections of South Africa, like the Western Cape, breaking away out of absolute necessity and survival.
Well, I actually had R.W. Johnson on my live stream about 2 or 3 months. Very interesting chat to him. Okay, now
I must look that up on your line. That must be an interesting interview.
it was. Michaela asked if you have it, the ULA website. I don't actually, Michaela, but I think if you just search on United Liberty Alliance Cape Town, you'll find their web. Okay, Dan Berryman has asked, Doctor, what is happening in the church today? In the States, they seem to be supporting chaos, and certainly in South Africa, they support black economic empowerment and affirmative action.
What we're seeing in the churches today is a terminal state of cowardice. Now, it starts from a watershed. A watershed is like the Drakensberg Mountains, the Dragon Mountains of South Africa. If water falls a few inches to the west of the watershed, the highest point of the mountains, then it's going to flow down into the Vaal and the Orange River and ultimately to the Atlantic Ocean. But if water falls just slightly to the east of that watershed on Drakensberg, it'll flow into the Tugela, Umzimvubu, and into the Indian Ocean. Right. Now, for the first few miles, it doesn't seem that serious, but ultimately gravity will determine it. Whichever side of the watershed you fall will determine where you'll end up thousands of kilometers away in different oceans, actually. And the watershed in a church is inerrancy of Scripture. And those Christians who fall down on inerrancy of Scripture, that Scripture is the ultimate authority, sola scriptura, they will inevitably be pro-life, pro-family. Marriage is a lifelong union between one man and one woman, things like that. People who compromise on inerrancy of Scripture and say, well, there might be some mistakes in Scripture and so on, they will ultimately end up being more pro-abortion, cultural Marxism, critical race theory, all the way through to, well, I guess you can have homosexual bishops and priests and marriages and things like that. And all the other things on that agenda, and they'll probably end up in billions of years ago and Big Bang and so on. So you don't see the difference too early on, but later on, as years go on, it becomes very obvious. Now, it's quite clear to me that the apostasy, which Francis Schaeffer warned about already in the 1970s, the great evangelical disaster, and he warned about these things, the church before the watching world, how should we then live? In many ways, very prophetic. I foresee this now. I see what I've seen over the last 44 years of being a Christian, a real apostasy, cowardice, and most church leaders today have fled from the fight. They're not interested in stand up for Jesus, or onward Christian soldiers, or fight the good fight of faith. What they're doing is they're compromising. It's all nice, feel-good, touchy-feely, non-confrontational, upbuilding, encouraging, affirming type of messages, which appeals to the sinful self. And this kind of Saddleback, Willow Creek purpose-driven, prayer of Jabez, materialistic, superficial, sensational, weak-kneed, weedy, wet, compromising, even jellyfish, filleted of spine, cowardly, compromising, craven traitors to the faith, I'm afraid is predominating. It starts in the theological seminaries, which have become theological cemeteries in many cases, and through many denominations, they've become abominations. And there are some brave, courageous, principled pastors and leaders and professors here and there, but I'm afraid the general picture of the church in the Western world is of absolute cowardice or irrelevancy. And you can see the proof right now in the streets of America. America's got more professional Christian leaders, full-time Christian leaders, I believe it's over 1 million than anywhere else on earth. They have got so many Bibles, so many evangelistic groups, so many different Christian ministries, so many TV programs devoted to Christian programs on. And yet, it's not just communists on the street throwing Molotov cocktails and rocks. In many cases, it's children from Christian homes and Christian churches who've gone through the youth groups, who've gone through the Christian universities in many cases. I know some of them have. And what you're seeing is evidently the kind of gospel they received in the youth groups, homes, or churches, or Christian universities was not enough to transform their lives for the good. And many are practical Marxists and revolutionaries right now. So if the church ever needed a wake-up call, it's the anarchy on the streets in America and the craven compromise of those who's bowing before them and even preaching the Black Lives Matter message, which is racist to the core, which
Absolutely.
is anti-Christian, and it's outrageous. Works-based salvation, which is completely anti-Christ and un-Christian, and yet so many Christians have endorsed it. Even pastors I know, churches that I've ministered in, have fallen into this, and I'm looking at this and thinking, unbelievable. And my friends in Eastern Europe are saying, this is worse than the dark days. You know, even under communism, we still walked our dog and had our church services. This lockdown is unbelievable, and the churches just have accepted. Hundreds of thousands of churches on Easter Sunday closed because of a virus. How can any government tell churches that you're not allowed to meet? Whatever happened to freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of movement? So the craven cowardice of churches throughout the West at this time is so chronic. If people don't realize we desperately need a Holy Spirit sent back to the Bible revival and biblical reformation, then they're not paying attention.
Right. I've got another question here we got a bunch of questions still to go. Tinus Muller has asked, Peter, what do you know about Pickborter and the Angolan diamonds?
Pickborter was South Africa's longest-running Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was compromised early on. The CIA covered for him with some scandal he had up in Scandinavia when he's an ambassador, I think, or consul up in Sweden. And he was bought and paid for and owned by globalist New World Order crowd early on. And he worked against our interest. He was involved in a whole bunch of very corrupt things, which word was that he was involved in smuggling operations in Angola, which included ivory poaching, for example. I do believe diamonds were part of this. And we know that Pickborter was so treacherous that after betraying P.W. Botha and others, who was at that time the president of the country, he changed his affiliation after Mandela became president and joined the African National Congress. So he became a member of the Southern Communist Party, effectively. So Pickborter, in Afrikaans, volksverraaier, or traitor.
Okay. Right, there's your answer. Now, Martin Olkers has asked, he's asked Dr. Hammond, where does he see us Afrikaners in the next couple of years in South Africa? I guess we've kind of answered that, but he's talking specifically about the Boers, the Afrikaners.
Well, you know, in Rhodesia, 20% of the white people in Rhodesia were Afrikaans. And of course, in the South African Army, I was in mostly South African Army, mostly Afrikaans Army. I think I was the only Engelssprekende in my whole platoon. And it was overwhelmingly Afrikaans in the army, and I grew to love and respect the Afrikaans people, and some of my very best friends are Afrikaans. The first mission I joined, Hospital Christian Fellowship, was thoroughly Afrikaans. And I must say, I was, as a person from a secular background coming from Rhodesia to South Africa, I was impressed by the godliness and the God-fearing Afrikaans people, and the Book of Fat, where they take the Bible and read the scriptures to the family and the servants, whoever was there, farm workers, after supper. And I was so amazed at just how what high standards Afrikaans people had, and the love, especially in the farming areas and out in Southwest Africa, Zudwest, what a magnificent place. So to this day, many Afrikaans people have tremendous backbone and are standing firm. But what bothers me is there's a whole lot of others amongst the Afrikaans people who've compromised and who've become cowardly and worldly, and many of the young people have apostatized and gone into the whole LGBTQ and communist side. So, of course, we've got that problem amongst the English-speaking South Africans too, but I expected it amongst them. They were the liberals. But it's been deeply distressing to see how many Afrikaans people have folded, and I'm afraid a lot of it's because of the cowardice of many of the church leaders. There are some fine Dutch-formed congregations, but the Dutch-formed church denomination as a whole seems to have compromised terribly from the top down. The Gereformeerde, not. I've seen the Gereformeerde Kerk stood very firm. I've seen some strength here and there, but I must say the Afrikaans country has never been as united as it was on the day of the Battle of Blood River. And even during the Anglo-Boer War, there were some who were on the other side, the Hensoppers and the people who actually fought on the British side and so on. But right now, it seems that the Afrikaans nation is very divided, tragically divided. And many have turned their back on their country, gone overseas and not looked back. And many have abandoned even their language. And I think that's extremely sad. So the Afrikaans nation desperately needs revival. What the Afrikaans people are going through right now is akin to what they were going through under the scorched earth campaign of the Anglo-Boer War, where the British were destroying not only the farms, but their livestock. They destroyed 30,000 farms in Orange Free State and Transvaal between 1900 and 1902. And the destruction of the women and children just hideous. And I think that's akin to what's happening now. You go to the Anglo-Boer War Women's Museum, Monument and Museum in Bloemfontein, and you can see the wall with the names of the 5,600 odd men who died in the war. Killed in action, died of diseases, died of wounds, all the details, date and so on. And then on the other side, you've got the names of over 32,000 women and children who died in the British concentration camps. Names, details, places. And what war do 5 to 6 times more women and children die than the men? It's just hideous, but that's what's happening now. Right now, the ANC farm-murdering thugs and EFF thugs are out there murdering mostly pensioners, women, children. This is it's genocide, actually. There's an attempt to destroy the Afrikaans people in every way. Culturally, linguistically, religiously, and of course destroying their very existence as well. So this is, by any definition of the word genocide, it's an attempt to genocide the Afrikaans people. And obviously we must stand up, we must resist, we must speak out about it, we must publish it, we must mobilize resistance to it. The people need to be as organized and in their community standing together. But where do I see the Afrikaans people going? Well, they will either revive and get strength and be more united to stand together and come out of this just like they came out of the Anglo-Boer War stronger, or they will fail and fade away, which I pray, God forbid, may it never happen. I'm deeply concerned for all of us. I'm an English-speaking Afrikaner, if one can allow that as a Rhodesian. I love the Afrikaans people. I have the Vierkleur in my office. I love the culture of the Afrikaans people. I've written the book Sketches from South African History, which is almost all Afrikaans hearers. Which I've never taken the side of the English and Anglo-Boer War, and I got into trouble at school in Rhodesia because I even as a youngster recognized that the Boers were in the right and the British were in the wrong in the Anglo-Boer War, and that wasn't a very popular position to hold in Rhodesia at that time. But I'm deeply concerned that the future of the Afrikaans nation is at stake, worse now than any time since 1902. And I pray for a revival amongst Afrikaans people. And of course, I'm working for it too. I'm really trying to encourage our people to stand up and to mobilize.
Right. Now, I've got a couple of questions here from Tyndale. Tyndale's been putting these questions up every 5 minutes, so you can stop putting them up now, Tyndale. Here they come. He says, Peter often says he believes Stephen Goodson may have been murdered. Could you please ask him to speak more on that, and also on the role of the Board of Jewish Deputies in South Africa?
Right. So first of all, Stephen Mitford Goodson was a healthy man. I think he was 58 when he died. He was in good shape. I saw him just a few days before he died, and he looked as healthy as anything to me. He's a guest speaker at a Reformation Society. We were making plans for the future, publishing and so on. His very close friends who were with him at the time visited him in hospital. Now, he's in hospital in Somerset West for something that was considered fairly routine. And he pleaded with his friend, please get me out of here. They're going to kill me here. And so she came back the next day to book him out of hospital and was informed he had died overnight. Then, she testified at his funeral, and I was asked to take the funeral, both this funeral service and the burial committal. And she testified at the service that she is convinced that he was murdered. Now, the next thing is his wife testified that she was told that his body was being taken off for cremation. And she said he expressly did not want cremation. He's a Christian. And she is a strong Christian and has great conscience objections to cremation. There's no way he'd want it. He expressly said he wanted to be buried, not cremated. So we had to do some extraordinary intervention to prevent the hospital from cremating the body. Now, why would they be in such a hurry to want to cremate the body, especially when it was against his wishes? So looking at the evidence, and you can actually go onto the Andrew Carrington Hitchcock site where there's interviews on Stephen Mitford Goodson, and I think he put the video there where Stephen Goodson spoke on South African television just shortly before his death. And on it, he named names. And I mean, he named Oppenheimers, he named the Ruperts and others. And he was speaking about the Southern Reserve Bank. And he spoke about state capture. And he was being very forthright. In fact, I was quite shocked when I saw this on national primetime TV in South Africa. He came out as a director of the Southern Reserve Bank speaking about the state capture and the names of the people behind and so on. So he certainly, in his books, in his writings, in his public speaking, and on national TV, named names and was getting to the heart of the financial corruption and intrigues and the banksters. And then suddenly he's just knocked off when he was healthy, and he predicted just a few hours before that he said, the people in this hospital are going to kill me. And his good friend who heard this was convinced that he was genuinely afraid for his life and that the people in the hospital did kill him. So that's as much as I know. I'm not a medical specialist. I wasn't actually there. I'm the person tasked with taking the funeral in the service, so I'm reporting what I heard.
Right. And the second part of that question was, what do you think about the role of the Board of Jewish Deputies in South Africa?
It's a negative role. For example, we had, when it came to just recently, I was part of a huge delegation of people meeting with in the N1 City in a church in Goodwood, the His People Church in N1 City Goodwood, with the it was Mr. Jeffries of the Department of Justice, and it was particularly us complaining about the so-called Ministry of Justice trying to bring in the hate speech bill and the registration of churches and licensing of ministers and all of these sort of things. And when I stood up to challenge him, where did this come from? Who has asked for this? You know, the hate speech bills and so on, to have sermons. He answered, the Jewish Board of Deputies. And I documented that in my article, Hate Speech, Threat to Free Speech, which is on our website. And it's just a shocking thing on the Christian Action website. Hate Speech, Threat to Free Speech. I've got a video on it, an expose. I stood up and I challenged this Mr. Jeffries of the Justice Department straight out. And he plainly said, well, the people who put this in motion was the Jewish Board of Deputies. So interesting. I've heard of their involvement in quite a number of other things. And by the way, in Nelson Mandela's book, he says that he was converted to communism while at Fort Hare University by Jewish communists of the Southern Communist Party, which is also what Robert Mugabe said. So there is some insidious involvement. But of course, who knows all that they're up to? Every now and then we just get a glimmer and a bit of a glimpse behind the curtain, what's going on behind the scenes.
Marlena, I haven't been able to get to the emails yet, so I'll do that just now. Liz, congratulations on winning the painting. You got an absolute steal at £6,000. Well done. Yeah, as Marlena says, if you can just send me an email, if you have, that's fine. After this live stream, I'll get to, I just can't break my concentration on this discussion right now. Okay, so Jacko Strauss has said, "Hi Peter, we met in Stellenbosch back in the 80s. Do you remember Jacko Strauss?"
I do, and in fact, our mission used to have a regular Bible study and prayer fellowship for Frontline Fellowship in Stellenbosch University, especially in the 1980s. In fact, Stellenbosch campus was our strongest base of operation for Frontline. We had a lot of our workers came from there. Loved those times. Greetings to you, Jacko. Good to hear from you.
Rainer Duplessis says, "Please, Dr. Peter." Hang on, that's not actually a question, so I'll miss that one. Ray Firster, please ask Peter his views concerning 5G, digital currency, universal income, and singularity, the new internet where all devices are connected.
Okay, well, I don't know much about the last two. I'm not a tech person, but I've read, studied, heard enough about 5G to be highly concerned that it's a health hazard and it's an ecological hazard and it's a hazard to birds and to wildlife. It's more than a human or animal body should be subjected to. And what's incredibly coincidental and disturbing is 5G was first rolled out in Wuhan, which is where the respiratory diseases came from. So I'm concerned. I don't think that we should accept 5G and its source and being pushed on us. And honestly, are they saying that what we've got right now isn't enough? I mean, how much more can we get? And this is a health hazard. There's no doubt about it. So I'm certainly against 5G.
And what about digital currency? Any thoughts on that?
I can't say much to it because I'm not an economist and I don't understand all the issues there.
I don't use it. I'd rather stick to physical gold and physical silver. Okay. Now, Renier Duplessis has asked, Dr. Peter, please tell us, how do we win the information war?
Great question. And in fact, we can win. And by the way, Psyops doesn't have to be just the realm of the enemy. Our side can engage in communications operations or psychological operations as well. And of course, we need to maximize the resources available to us. Now, door-to-door evangelism was a very good way of operating when I was first converted. But these days, you can't do it as much. People are barricaded, barred. You often can't even get to the door. So there's no doubt that things are moving more and more digital, using digital platforms, whether it's as Twitter, Facebook, websites. We've got to use it all, and podcasts and all this, Skype. We've got to use all the means we can to communicate to as many people as we can truth and inspiration and encouragement. Expose the bad, promote the good. So I do believe we can learn to discern. We can recapture the community for Christ. We should be continually cultivating discernment and discretion. as to what can be trusted and what cannot be. Let's not waste our time or our minds or allow our children to go down dark and dangerous alleys and to all kinds of who knows what. Just like in any country or any city, you'll have some parts that you'd want to avoid and some place you wouldn't want to go through those doors. So it would be on the internet and so on too. So we've got to teach discernment and discretion about what films we allow to influence us or come to our children or in our homes, just as we would with books, and so we should with a podcast and what we view and so on. So I think it's super important that we be those who cultivate what's good, and we should be super active. I've managed on, in fact, I'm running personally something like 20 different Facebook pages.
Wow.
And you may be surprised at some of the ones that I get. And you would be absolutely surprised at my most popular one. The most popular Facebook page, which, by the way, reached 50 million people last year.
Wow.
With literally hundreds of thousands of engagements, is Wonderful Wildlife. I mean, I'm a conservationist.
Yeah.
I love wildlife. And my Wonderful Wildlife page is seriously the most popular. And Vikings for Christ is also surprisingly popular. I'm a real history buff, and I like Vikings, and my family are Vikings, and Hammonds used to be the Hammers of Thor, invaded England in 1066 and all that sort of thing. So not to change the world, Reformation 500. One of my busiest sites is Henry Morton Stanley's School of Christian Journalism. It's quite a mouthful, but the greatest journalist of all time, in my opinion, is Henry Morton Stanley, the man who found David Livingstone, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, that sort of thing.
Right.
So the Henry Morton Stanley School of Christian Journalism Facebook page, I put a lot of news source things on that is countercultural, not politically correct. And it's amazingly popular, a lot of shares. For the Rhodesians, I'm the chairman of the local Flame Lily Foundation Cape Peninsula. And so I've got Flame Lily Foundation - Cape Peninsula, which posts a lot of Rhodesian memorabilia, and I can have a single post of several pictures and so on, which can have an 80,000 or 150,000, or even on one occasion a 300,000 reach, which is more than the population we had in Rhodesia, with vast amounts of engagements and shares and comments, and not just hundreds, but thousands of comments. And it's wonderful getting ex-Rhodesians sharing their insights, and I can post some pictures and person say, I know this person and this is my neighbor, and I give you more details. And so that's quite amazing. Of course, my main page is Frontline Fellowship, our mission, but we've got a range of others. Like on the Greatest Century of Missions, I share what happened on this day, and on Victorious Christians Who Changed the World, I share also great things that happened in history. So you'll see, because of my interests of history and wildlife and conservation and warfare, I've found it necessary to have different pages up and running. My wife's got Victorious Christians Who Changed the World, and we've reached an incredible amount of people through social media alone, just Facebook. But then there's also SlideShares. I've got 249 PowerPoints up on SlideShare, and some of them have had 20 or 30,000 views. Sermon audio, I've got 850 of my sermons and lectures on sermon audio and on a whole range of subjects. In fact, if a person wanted to go on sermon audio, which has got a huge amount of sermons, and just type in something like, how were the Vikings won to Christ? The only thing that'll come up is what I've said, because who else speaks on the Vikings? If you ask, the causes and consequences of the First World War, I think my one will be the only one that comes up. I mean, who speaks on that? Yeah. And so on. Or I speak about the Bolshevik Revolution or the French Revolution, because those are things I do in our midweek service at our Reformation Society. And on sermon audio, often I've got the only message on that particular subject, because I'm dealing with history a lot. So I think Vimeo as well, I've put quite a lot on. One of the things I've started to do is I've got a screen capture method that when I give a presentation at a Reformation Society, I am creating a video from my PowerPoint and audio, so that the screen capture video then goes up the next week, and a person can choose to watch a video of my PowerPoint presentation, or flick through the PowerPoint, or listen to the audio lecture. So I'm using multimedia to communicate. And the reason why I personally focus the most on history is because I perceive that's what's under attack by the Marxists. History is the first battlefield, according to Karl Marx. And because they're attacking our history, I'm trying to promote real history and lift up our examples of excellence. And once you've looked at the examples of excellence, you can't accept the narrative of the Marxist revolutionaries in the street because, what do you mean apologize for slavery? Christians ended slavery 200 years ago. Christians have always been in the forefront of fighting slavery. Nobody else fought slavery except Christians. Every religion and people practiced slavery. Only evangelical Protestant Christianity brought an end to slavery. And so these are the things. When you've looked at the lives of David Livingstone and William Wilberforce and Mary Slessor and C.T. Studd, then the narrative of evil white men, poor, innocent, noble savages and so on, it falls by the wayside because there's nothing like facts to destroy a good story. And I'm applying the truth to destroy the Marxist narrative on a daily basis. So, yes, we can use the media, and I use it all the time in communications operations or cyber against our Marxist enemies.
Right. Mrs. G has said, what are your thoughts on South Africa going forward? I think we've answered that question, so I'm just going to miss that one. Now, Mrs. G also asked, in your missionary work, have you found any groups of black Africans who have built their own independence?
Well, yes, I have, but obviously with outside help normally, part of communities. So, for example, up in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan, I've been working with the people there to achieve their independence, to resist Islamic terrorism and aggression and oppression. And in South Sudan, I worked very long and hard with South Sudan to secede. And in fact, right back in 1995, I was arguing with the leader of the SPLA, Colonel John Garang, who is the leader of the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, that you need to fight for secession. He says that's not possible. All we can do is fight for autonomy because African Union has never accepted the redrawing of the map since the Berlin Conference of 1885. They treat those boundaries like sacrosanct, even though that they make no geological sense, demographic sense. They cut across boundaries of ethno-linguistic people groups and so on. And but I said, you will always be a minority in a Muslim Arab country being persecuted for being black Christians unless you secede. Because while black Christians are the majority in the south of Sudan, you're a minority in the whole of Sudan. And unless you redraw the map, you're going to be a persecuted minority forever. And as recently as 2001, I was arguing with Commander Silva Kiir, who is the second command under John Garang at that time, about it. And he said it's not possible to have independence. Well, interestingly, just 10 years later, he became president of South Sudan. So Commander Silva Kiir, now president of South Sudan, didn't believe it was possible that South Sudan could even be independent just 10 years before. And so I was working with them and arguing. And of course, I did more than 1,000 church services, leadership training courses, God and government seminars, biblical worldview seminars, started 100 schools in South Sudan, did all sorts of work amongst them and campaigned for the independence outside. But the South Sudanese fought and won the independence and are building the community, and Nuba Mountains is trying to win the independence. So there are communities in Africa that are trying, but obviously they need help, and it's a privilege for any of us to help them. We must always stand with fellow believers wherever they are.
Now, Renier Duplessis has asked, the church used to be the center of the community. What went wrong?
Right. This is very important and good to say. And I've looked at this in great length. In fact, just on one particular article of mine, which is a major subject that I've written on, how the greatest century of missions was derailed into the worst century of persecution. The 19th century was the greatest century of missions, the greatest century of Christian expansion, the greatest century of inventions, the greatest century of hymns, and many other things. The 20th century has been the worst century in history. In terms of persecution church, more people have been martyred for the faith in the 20th century than have died for Christ in all the other 19 centuries combined. The 20th century is not the best century. It's actually the worst in terms of massacres, especially at the hands of communist governments and so on. Worst century of terrorism and everything. Forget Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun. The 20th century under Stalin and Mao Zedong has been the worst on every level. And how did that happen? Well, convincing Christians to fight one another in the First World War. Where did it go wrong? 1914. The greatest century of missions was derailed in the worst century of persecution when Christians were convinced to kill one another. And the banksters, taking the word banker and gangster and putting it together. The banksters were behind it. Freemasons, Antichrist, Bilderbergers, Rothschilds, Illuminati, Council of Foreign Relations, a whole bunch. They orchestrated that Protestant Germans and Protestant English were killing one another. Catholic Austrians and Catholic French fighting one another. That you had on different sides people of the same faith murdering one another by the millions in industrial efficiency. And beyond comprehension, the destruction of Western Christian civilization in the First World War, and of course in the Second, and the betrayal of Eastern Europe, Yalta Agreement, but the saving of the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and so many things like that were part of it. So you can see in architecture when you travel around South Africa and many other parts of the Western world, the biggest, tallest building in the center of town is the church and the church steeple. In many cases, it's still so, and especially small villages, the church steeple or the cathedral is still the tallest and it's the most central. And that's the way it always was, geographically, architecturally, socially, in every way. The church was the center of life. But you can see what changed in the 20th century. I think, firstly, before the First World War, 64% of the people of Europe were in church every Sunday, on average. 64% before the First World War. By the beginning of the Second World War, it was down to 42% were in church every Sunday on average. After the Second World War, it went down to 4%. 4% of Europe doing church attendance. Right now, Europe's at something like 5 or 6% in total. And to be honest, most of that's health is in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe has the strongest amount of Christians. And this is intriguing, that the seduction and erosion and compromise and materialism of Western Europe has been more deadly to the church than the violent communist persecution and atheist indoctrination of Eastern Europe. Today, the largest number of Christians, in terms of millions of Christians, the largest number of Bible-believing, born-again Christians in Europe are in Russia.
Right.
Number 2, Ukraine. Number 3, Romania. What do they have in common? All behind what used to be the Iron Curtain. There are some bright spots spiritually in Western Europe, like Northern Ireland, but generally speaking, Western Europe's a bit of a spiritual wasteland. There's spots of life. I've had ministry across 20-odd countries in Europe. I've done a lot of missions in Europe, and I can tell you one of my most successful camps, a Reformation and Revival camp, attended by 960 people on Reformation Revival, was in the Netherlands. You can't say, I've had a ministers' conference of 480-odd ministers gathered in Switzerland. So there is spiritual life in Europe, especially in Romania and Russia and Ukraine. But Europe is devastated. And, it's because of the First and Second World War, which was fought for nefarious reasons. And the official version doesn't come close to the truth. And so it's basically Europe's auto-genocide. So I think that's a long part of it. When we're convinced to fight one another, that's the worst. And why is the church no longer the center? Because Christians allowed themselves to be deceived into fighting their brothers and sisters in Christ. We need to remember who the enemy is. We must never waste our time and energy fighting against those on our side. You've got to distinguish between sports field competition, which is healthy, and battlefield, when you recognize that even the Air Force and the Marines and so on, they're our allies, they're on the same side. You've got to distinguish between the enemy and your competitors. And so once we got on the board and we faced a common enemy, everything became clear. But I think the average Christian doesn't see that we're in a state of emergency, we're in a state of war, does not recognize who the enemy is. And let's face it, the most Christians waste their lives on trivial things and spend most of their aggression on fellow Christians or family members.
Right. Well, what I find really disturbing is what's written in the book, Wall Street Funded Hitler. And it's written by a fellow by the name of, have you heard of the book?
Yes, by Sutton.
Yes,
yes.
By Sutton.
He also wrote on Wall Street and the funding of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah, well, the thing that I find most disturbing in everything that he says in that book, we know that the Bushes were involved and all these other people were involved in funding Adolf Hitler. But the thing I found most disturbing was that while the Allies were bombing Berlin to the ground and millions of people were being affected by this, the electricity, or the power stations, which were basically owned by Wall Street were deliberately not targeted. That's actually in that book. He says that they targeted innocent people, but they didn't. The bombers didn't go and target the power stations, which were owned by companies in quite extraordinary.
Yes, at the end of the war, I.G. Farben's headquarters, which was half American-owned and half German-owned, I.G. Farben's massive headquarters was the only untouched building in Frankfurt. Everything else was leveled, and that became the headquarters for Eisenhower. Very interesting, they hung all the German board members of I.G. Farben, and the Americans took over the whole of I.G. Farben. But the amount of when you start to get other sides of history that isn't part of the narrative that Hollywood wants you to keep repeating like a mantra, you find that the story is very different. And as a missionary to the persecuted church, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, everywhere from Poland in the north down to Albania in the south. And I've got a lot of friends from Eastern Europe. And what they had to say shocked my world and shook my understanding, because they would say things like, what freedom? We never got any freedom. You fought for freedom and democracy and Western civilization. You betrayed us. What do you mean we betrayed you? Well, you British and Americans, you betrayed us. You betrayed us to Stalin, to the Soviet Union, to the worst mass murdering dictator in history. Yalta Agreement. And Yalta Agreement? What happened to Yalta? I didn't understand it. And then I go to Poland and there's this Katyn Forest Massacre Memorial, and it says 1940. And I said, don't you mean 1941? They said, don't tell us you believe the communist propaganda. What propaganda? They said, do you think the Germans killed the Polish officers at Katyn? I said, well, that's what our history books told us, yes. I said, everyone knows the Russians did. Do you know where Katyn is? No. Have you ever looked at a map? No. They showed me the map. Well, Katyn is right up by Smolensk. That's virtually Moscow. Yeah. It's vast distance from Poland. What do you mean the Germans killed the Polish officers at Katyn? Just look at a map. But at the Nuremberg trials, they were indicted, amongst other things, for the Katyn Forest Massacre of Polish officers. And, the evidence was just then the Poles never let this go. And in the end, even Yeltsin and Putin's government had to hand over the documentation. Yeah, we knew all the time it was a Stalin order. It was straight from the top to kill the entire Polish officer corps, the entire intelligentsia and leaders of the whole nation of Poland were shot in the back of the neck, systematic massacres, huge. And of course, our side knew it, but they put the blame on their enemy, which is very convenient. But then the Poles told me, just like your Winston Churchill assassinated our leader, General Sikorski. I mean, General Sikorski was assassinated by Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill provided him with the plane, sent him off via Gibraltar to Egypt, and he was killed in Egypt, in Gibraltar on his way back from Egypt, and 1943. Why? Because the Katyn Forest Massacre had been exposed, and he insisted on international investigation, Red Cross and so on. And Winston Churchill was then told by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you've got to get rid of Sikorski. Now remember, Sikorski was the commander-in-chief of the Polish government in exile, right, and meant to be an ally. And in fact, Britain's meant to be at war for Poland. I mean, that's the ostensible reason why Britain declared war on Germany on 3rd of September 1939. So Sikorski being assassinated by the British side, and this is what the Polish people believe firmly to this day, and the evidence is there. But these sort of things you can imagine, as somebody who thought he knew his history pretty well, I get to Eastern Europe and I'm getting a whole new lesson. Did you know that we had Ukrainian army fighting resistance against the Soviets until 1955, 10 years after the Second World War was over? We're still fighting in company strength with artillery against the Soviet army? No idea. Did you know in Lithuania, the Lithuanian army was fighting the Forest Brothers till 1954, 9 years after the Second World War? We never got a bullet, a bandage, or one bit of aid from the Western Allies, while you were sending trillions of dollars of aid to the Soviet Union. You saved the Soviet Union. You betrayed 150 million Christians in 10 nations behind the Iron Curtain to Stalin through the Yalta Agreement. And of course, I had no idea about this. This doesn't come through in the Hollywood films. This doesn't come through.
No, it's all BS.
Of the 20th century that most people are ignorant of, because we have been sold a lie. Wartime propaganda has morphed into peacetime textbooks. I'm glad that my first history teacher in Rhodesia was a historian who spoke straight. Here's Mr. Rhys Davies. He's also a member of Parliament in Rhodesia. And he said, just beware the victor's version. Wartime propaganda morphs into peacetime textbooks. Governments lie. And your textbooks, it said never regurgitate textbook. Think outside the box. Ask questions. And I'm glad for a good education like that. And the education that got behind the Iron Curtain from the persecuted church.
Right. Now, Erica asks, why is all the history in South Africa so twisted? Why is everything so secret around the real history? Where can we find the truth when it comes to the history of the country?
Indeed. And it's for this reason. Victors write the textbooks and beware the victor's version. So I've written the books, Sketches from South African History, which is now translated into Afrikaans, Sketsa uit die Suid-Afrikaanse Geskiedenis, and putting down South African history, going from before Jan van Riebeeck all the way through, giving our history right down to the betrayal under F.W. de Klerk to Mandela and beyond. But positive, uplifting, examples of excellence, chapters on Emily Hobhouse and on General Delaray and De Wet and Andrew Murray. And it's just because I homeschool my children, I was deeply disturbed that most of our history books were just inadequate. And so I saw the need to produce a history book that preserves our history. And now it comes along with an audio box set where we've got a whole lot of videos and audios from our Reformation Society and education days, because our history is under attack. It's so important that the next generation know our history and our heritage and our heroes and our heroines, and they know about Volrod Voltemade, and they know what was done by all the different, Paul Kruger, and what tremendous stories we've got. So I'm convinced of the importance of preserving our history. I've been to all of our historical and battle sites and hiked Majuba and all that with my children, and been to Battle of Blood River and Ungungungluvo and to Islawan and Rookstrift. And putting all this together with the pictures, I've seen our history under attack. Monuments destroyed, museums looted, artifacts destroyed, and to try to preserve as much as possible photographically, digitally, PowerPoints, videos, audios, and to get it in book format. We must not allow our children to forget our history and heritage. As George Orwell said, the quickest way to destroy people is to obliterate the understanding of their own history. And so that's what's going on in the streets of America. That's what's going on in South Africa. I'm sure Australia too, where there's an attempt by Marxists to destroy your history and to destroy your heroes. And have you noticed how Hollywood is so busy trying to promote fake heroes? I don't like these superhero fakes that they're pushing us beyond ridiculous with exploding buildings and universes from Marvel Comics, because they're fake heroes. We've got real heroes. We don't need their blasted fake heroes. And they're taking a generation away from reality and getting them addicted to the fake to such an extent that you've got this young generation who get angry at the truth. They're so fed with fake food, fake news, fake everything, fake people, that now they're offended by the truth.
Yeah. Well, I find it's extraordinary because Hollywood apparently now is pretty well run by China. They've got a huge financial investment. Apparently is why a lot of the new films are kind of culturally sympathetic to China.
Yes. In fact, I've got an interesting observation there, because some time ago I was invited in 2014, the 100th anniversary of the First World War, and I was at a conference, spoke on it and so on in Britain. And then I went to the Imperial War Museum, and part of the Imperial War Museum
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Interrupt you for a second. Dan, have you met Dan Berryman?
I don't know. Connection? Place?
Well, he's an ex-priest. He's a retired priest. And he does our weekly Sunday service on this channel. And he's a lovely guy. And if you haven't met him, I'd love to put you guys in touch with each other. Look, I'll speak to Dan separately. And sorry, back to you. The reason I'm talking about this is because he's just logging off and going. So I thought I'd just catch him before he goes. Back to you. Sorry.
Thank you. So they had a section in Imperial War Museum on the British Secret Service. And interesting, looking at the British Secret Service, the real enemies of the realm, IRA, bombings and all this sort of thing. And, of course, Falkland War and Iranian embassy. And went through all these different things. So how interesting. None of the James Bond films ever have dealt with the real enemies of the realm. They never deal with the IRA or with jihadists. They never deal with Red China. In fact, notice even in the James Bond films, China's never the enemy. In fact, at one point, the Chinese Secret Service were the ally to find the real enemy, who was a editor of a newspaper. And this is what I find the cowardice, not just of Hollywood, but of the British film industry. They don't want to address the real issues. And so they come up with these unbelievably fake ones. And unfortunately, we're now so used to it right now that most people believe the fake and they distrust the truth.
Yeah, it's crazy. Okay, now Renell Griffiths has asked, please ask what version of the Bible is the most reliable.
I personally am a New King James man. New King James Version, I think, is the best translation, and it's the most faithful. Now, historically, the King James Version has been the best. English language has changed a bit. So the New King James, which is also from the Textus Receptus, from the most reliable text, not the Alexandrian text and so on. So it's the Antioch text. So I'm convinced that the best Bibles would be the King James and the New King James, but the New King James is more true to our present language. I'm told by some that the English Standard Version is also excellent. I don't personally use it, so I couldn't comment on that. But I once had the opportunity to interview Professor Dr. Francis Nigel Lee, who I think many people in Australia know. He's a South African. Professor Dr. Advocate Nigel Lee was a professor at Queensland Presbyterian Theological Seminary, I believe, and he wrote a lot of books. He had something like 14 doctorates and 20-something degrees, most educated man in the world. Great man. Anyway, I had chance of sharing platforms with him in South Africa and in America at conferences, and hiked up Lion's Head with him and so on. And I wish I'd had a microphone recording him when I was hiking with him, because I asked him that very question. I mean, here's the most educated man in the world, great Reformed pastor and professor. What's the most reliable translation in the world? And he immediately said, Martin Luther's translation in German. He reads it every day. So I was, yes, and in English, he said, well, he does his devotions every day with Martin Luther's German translation, and then also his Greek New Testament, and he finds that's pretty good. So, yes, sir, and in English. And then, well, the Geneva Bible was really good, and so on. And basically what it came down to at the end of it was, well, if you can't read German and you don't read Greek, then I suppose the King James or the New King James would be the best. So now I've summarized a 20-minute conversation from an incredible academic. But I think that's the most reliable for study. But of course, for a person for whom English is their second language, there's nothing wrong with them getting an easier translation. It makes it easier to understand. I was personally converted through the Good News Bible, today's English version, and at Theological College we studied through the New International Version. But shortly thereafter, I moved on to New King James, and everything I put in my books and in our frontline newsletters and on our web is New King James Version.
Right. Now, Downey has asked, what is church's role in deceit? Do you believe that if church was right, why did they do nothing when Ramaphosa denied farm murders? Why have God's promises left if they, the church, were right?
Well, you can be sure that I, as a South African and a missionary for the last 40 years, I've consistently spoken out against communism, against the ANC, against communist terrorism. I have marched 30,000 people to Parliament at one time and many more at other times to protest against Mandela, Mbeki, Zuma, Ramaphosa, and we oppose and we expose. Of course, don't expect us to get the same kind of media coverage as the cowardly, spineless, apostate World Council of Churches affiliates would. So to say no pastors are speaking out against it is probably not true. There's probably quite a number of pastors in South Africa speaking out against it, but they're not getting much media coverage. But denominational leaders tend to have reached the position of being heads of major denominations by a lot of compromise and politics. So those people are not the ones you'd probably expect to be speaking out against it. So make no mistake, as Elijah felt, only I am left. And then God said to him in 1 Kings 18, no, I've reserved 7,000 in Israel who have not yet bowed the knee to Baal. And I can tell you, I think there's more than thousands. There's hundreds of thousands who haven't bowed the knee to Baal, including in our country here. So the situation is probably not as bad as you think, but it's certainly very bad when you're dealing with top church leaders. There's a lot of apostasy out there, and that needs to be challenged.
Enough, that's one of Dan Berryman's huge beefs, is the Council of Churches who are, he has a problem with them in South Africa. But obviously not
Apostate.
with ministers who are, Okay, now, sorry, you want to say?
No, you're quite right. We've got a lot of faithful ministers. Let's not tar everyone with the same brush. There's a lot of apostasy and compromise, but there's also a lot of faithful people, and let's keep praying for and supporting them.
Absolutely. Okay, now Tyndale has asked, please dedicate part of this secession to solutions. What is the conclusion of the whole matter?
Solution.
The solution.
Back to the Bible, back to God, back to the Bible Reformation, prayer for spiritual revival, get back to biblical principles. The family is the basic building block of society. The municipality is the basic building block of the nation. Decentralization, bring taxation way down to under 1%, manage to decentralize all power down to the local community, make sure that we don't have top-heavy, corrupt, inefficient government, limit government to its biblical functions, national defense, law and order, justice, that's it. They're not meant to be involved in the economy and health and so on. Leave that to the local community. Leave that to the parents. Leave these things to the free market. And so, obviously, we need to get back to biblical principles. I've written a book, Biblical Principles for Africa, which is translated into French and Afrikaans and multiple editions, popular because the Bible's got the solutions on every level.
Right. Okay, now, the next question is from Jacques Fev. He says, please, Peter, what can you tell us of Magnus Milan, Rolf Meyer, and Constant Viljoen?
Okay, 3 very different people. Rolf Meyer, we called him the Canary. I think he was in the army, maybe a lance corporal in the choir. And next thing we know, he's Minister of Defense, and he's taken over the place of Magnus Milan. And Magnus Milan was a general, and he was a pretty respected soldier. Rolf Meyer was nothing of the sort. Now, Rolf Meyer, as General Secretary or Secretary General of the National Party, he hired a couple of witch doctors to design a new corporate image for the National Party.
What?
We talk about 1990 now. And they designed this scrambled eggs looking new design thing. And he hired witch doctors to dedicate a National Party office in Soweto, where they killed a goat and wrapped the entrails around him and so on. How a man like that, who's a member of a Reformed church, didn't get excommunicated, who knows? But then again, his boss, F.W. de Klerk, got in line to receive Mass from Pope John Paul when he visited South Africa, along with Nelson Mandela, and they both knelt down and let the Pope put Mass. Now, Nelson Mandela's meant to be a Methodist. He was actually an atheist and a Communist Party Politburo member, but he knelt down to get the Mass from John Paul. F.W. de Klerk's meant to be a member of a Reformed church. That's excommunicatable offense to receive the Mass, which is blasphemy, actually, from a Catholic. As for the Catholic canon law, any Catholic priest who administered the Mass to someone who wasn't a catechized, baptized member of the Catholic Church should have been kicked out of the priesthood as well. So there was compromise on every side. But this old Rolf Meyer, he was such a low-life Marxist. He has come on national TV saying he supported Ramaphosa, his good friend Ramaphosa's expropriation without compensation campaign. He has come out that he fully trusts and supports the ANC. He came out saying that he advised people to vote for the ANC last year in the May elections 2019. So Rolf Meyer is a complete and utter traitor on every level, Volksverräter in Afrikaans. I met Rolf Meyer back in 1992, and I was with a delegation from United Christian Action, and Ed Kane, who was the president of United Christian Action at the time, a very respected old man, was giving very politely concerns, while Rolf Meyer strode up and down in front of, I think we're in front of the City Hall in Pretoria, and Rolf Meyer is in his suit and he's striding up and down, not even looking at him, just obviously angry. And as he strode up and down, he suddenly exploded with anger at Ed Kane, saying, "There's no problem from the left. It's you right-wing fundamentalist Christians. You're the problem." So I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, there's no need for you to talk like that to Dr. Ed Kane." And he turned around and said, "And you! I know all about you, Peter Hammond. I know about you. Yes, I know about you, Peter Hammond. You're the problem." And we just stood around there amazed. I mean, this is the National Party. This is 1992. We'd just won the Cold War. We'd beaten the commies on the border. What's going on here? We didn't fully understand what was going on yet, but we had this horrible sneaking suspicion that the National Party might be betraying us, which obviously they were. I didn't understand the full Broederbond involvement and everything else that was going on behind the scenes, and I certainly didn't know about Oppenheimer's, De Beers involvement at that stage. But so that's what I can say about Rolf Meyer. Low-life Marxist traitor scum. Now, General Constant Viljoen, great man, great soldier, not a particularly good politician, but a fine soldier. During Operation Septic, or Smoke-Shell as it was called, General Constant Viljoen, as chief of the army, at that stage he wasn't chief of the defense force, he was chief of the army, went in behind enemy lines deep into Angola, and his Ratel, his armored car, hit a landmine, and he went flying through the air and picked up his R1, picked up his beret, and came to the bush, and he looked a bit of a mess. And several people in our unit were a bit surprised and said, General Viljoen's normally absolutely immaculate, and he really looked disheveled. And it was months later that the story came out, and we realized, he had just been blown up in a landmine, and he didn't say anything about it. But General Constant Viljoen is the kind of person we would have followed him anyway. And so back in 1992-93, when he was going around the country mobilizing the Freedom Alliance against the ANC takeover and the National Party betrayal, I was one of those who went to these meetings up in Brackenfell, and the hall was just packed to overflowing. There were something like 2,000 people in. At the tables, people signing up for his commando, and I was one of about 85,000 people who signed up for General Viljoen's commandos, that if he called, we would go and we would fight, and we expected civil war any time. And I got my webbing and boots and everything out, and I was ready, along with many others. I mean, if General Viljoen had given the word, there was a whole lot of us who were ready to stand fight, and we were surprised, pleasantly surprised, but surprised when he announced that he was going in for the election and called for us to vote. I thought we were going to go to war, but it gave the impression that he had been given an assurance by Nelson Mandela, and there was an accord that he'd support self-determination, he'd support a homeland for the Afrikaners, and so on. I think those were the words. So we thought, fair enough. Okay, if General Viljoen thinks that there's an opportunity for this, let's go along with him. But I think we're going to have to fight them somewhere along the line. And so General Viljoen could have called on many of us. There was a lot of us who had fought in SADF, 650,000 actually, who had served in the SADF, many of which with combat experience over the years, and most of whom owned their own firearms anyway, who could have been called on. I'm sure this caused a massive headache for Nelson Mandela, because he knew that General Viljoen had a lot of support, and there's a lot of South Africans who had experience and competency and could be called upon, and the ANC would not have what it took to be able to resist him. So General Viljoen was, I've hosted him in my home, I've interacted with him when he was leader of the Freedom Front and in Parliament. And one of the funny stories about him is that on the first day of the new Parliament, 1994, May, General Viljoen sat up there at the first caucus meeting of the newly elected Freedom Front members of Parliament, and he said, "Gentlemen, there's litter downstairs. This is unacceptable. We will go down and do a chicken parade, and we must lead by example and pick this up." And Peter Mulder said, "Sir, there's people assigned whose job it is to do that." And General said, "That's not good enough. We've got to lead by example. Come, gentlemen." And he got up, and all of the Freedom Front members of Parliament, along with the General, did a line through Parliament and picked up all litter. And Peter Mulder said to me, "General Groenewold was doubtless a good general, but he didn't really understand politics." And but I must say, I highly respected and trusted him, and I would have gone to war for him.
Right. Okay, next question. Red Sky Mountaintop says, "Scott, please ask Peter what his views are of Sina van Rensburg."
I can't say much about that. I've heard a few things. I'm obviously extremely skeptical of any prophet, outside the Bible, that is. So I know that some of what he said seems uncannily relevant to what we're facing right now, but I personally do not put much credence by it, even though it does look quite intriguing.
Right. Okay. Tyndale's asked a very important question. Very concerning question. He says the Satanic Church in South Africa has been legalized. What are Peter's thoughts?
It's wicked, it's unacceptable, and as far as I'm concerned, the Satanic Church is an illegal enterprise in every single way, because we've got laws against cruelty to animals, and they are involved in cruelty to animals and animal sacrifices. They involved in all kinds of things which involve human sacrifices too sometimes, if they're true Satanists. So how on earth can you legalize something that is built on violating of laws of morality, of property, of life, sanctity of marriage, and all that? So to legalize Satanist church is, of course, absolutely wicked, but it's symptomatic of a society that no longer fears God, no longer honors God, and is no longer based on the rock of God's word. And in some ways, it's logical consistency once you've legalized abortion, pornography, prostitution, adultery, every kind of evil, perversion, what God calls an abomination called a marriage. So you can see already that the trajectory of the ANC from the time Mandela took place has been leading to this kind of position. Of course, it's been practiced. Now it's blatant.
Right. Now, just for the record, I'm just going to talk to the side chat and everybody watching at the moment. We've got well over 200 people watching. Guys, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. I'm going to be shutting down the live stream probably in the next 15-20 minutes. We've got 3 more questions to go. Lizzie, congrats on winning that beautiful lion painting. I'll be checking my email after the live stream, and I'll get in touch with Marlena. Okay, let's get into the final 3 questions. And I just want to add something to this question, a fact which I think I find very disturbing. Carlos Guter says, "Is Karl Marx and the Rothschilds cousins?" Now, this is unrelated to that particular question, but the Rothschilds have got an office in Johannesburg, and the guy who now heads it up used to be the Minister of Finance in South Africa. That says some very, very disturbing things to me about their control over the South African economy. So perhaps you can look at that as well as are Karl Marx and Rothschild's cousins.
One thing that's fascinating is when I went to Kimberley a while ago, I always try to put in a bit of history if we've got at all time between our school meetings and church meetings and so on, and went to the museum. That's the museum owned by Anglo-American De Beers at Kimberley. And interesting, at the museum, which is by the big hole, the Great Hole of Kimberley and so on, they've got on display the biggest check ever written to that date, and it's for £1 million back in 1869 or whatever it was, to Cecil John Rhodes. So there's £1 million check, million, 1860s, 70s money. That's quite extraordinary amount of money. And
it'd be about 100 billion today, wouldn't it?
Oh, easily, or more. So to think that Rothschild, out of the goodness of his heart, was willing to put so much money in the hands of Cecil John Rhodes, obviously for altruistic motives, without any kickbacks or desires to pull strings to consolidate the diamond mines in Kimberley. Now notice, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's in De Beers' own mind. They've got the actual check behind bulletproof glass on display.
I've actually seen that same check. I went to that museum and I can confirm I've seen it. I've actually got a photograph of it. Unfortunately, I'd have to find it, but yeah, it's extraordinary.
Yeah, it's uncanny when you see those sort of things. Hard proof. It's what you call proof from a hostile witness, when the other side is confirming what's been said. You know, what more can you say? That is pretty hard proof.
Yeah. Okay, now Fiona Timms has asked, was the church giving money to the ANC in the 1950s onwards? My dad said so. Apparently her dad had a big falling out with the church after that happened and whatever. Yeah.
Yes and no. The church, capital C, did not. But the church, as in the Southern Council Churches, World Council Churches, National Council Church of America, they were supporting the African National Congress, ZANU, ZAPU, FRELIMO, MPLA, were all getting funds. So it came under what was called the Program to Combat Racism, PCR, the Program to Combat Racism. So the World Council Churches took money from affiliates of the National Council Church of America, which would have included Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and so on, and of course from the Council of Churches in Europe and probably Southern Council Churches too. So the contributions from National Council of Churches coming to the World Council of Churches, they took and gave money to terrorists who, for example, murdered the Elam missionaries, 13 British missionaries at Elam Mission School in Matari, and killed Salvation Army and Baptist missionaries in Rhodesia, and murdered ambulance drivers for the Red Cross, and so on. So Felimo, who chopped the head of a priest, put it on the altar in Mozambique, or fed 42 women and children through a chainsaw in Angola. These terrorists who were doing these heinous acts, burning churches with the whole congregation, were actually funded by the World Council of Churches under the so-called Program to Combat Racism. And everybody who is a member of a National Council of Churches, some of their money was going to World Council Churches, some of which was being allocated to terrorists. This was reported. The man who first blew the whistle on this was our first board member of Frontline Fellowship, Father Arthur Lewis. And Father Arthur Lewis was a Church of England missionary, spent 52 years in the field, first in Tanganyika, then in Rhodesia, later in South Africa. And he's a board member of Frontline since 1982, since the beginning of Frontline. And he published Christian Terror. Now, I've republished the book and we've made a free ebook. So if a person goes into frontlinemissionsa.org website, frontlinemissionsa.org, you can see at the bottom page it's got free PDF books. And one of those is Christian Terror by Father Arthur Lewis, which was the first to blow the whistle. I think it was 1976, on how the World Council Church was funding terrorists who were murdering Christians and missionaries in Rhodesia. And it's got the pictures, it's got the stats, and that was what was reprinted in Reader's Digest, which led to the Baptists and the Salvation Army pulling out of the World Council of Churches as a direct result. That so Father Arthur Lewis was the whistleblower on the fact that the church, or the World Council of Churches, apostates, were taking church money to fund terrorists to murder Christians and missionaries.
I have to tell you that Fiona, we call her the White Zulu on our channel. She's an author as well, and lovely stories she tells, and we put them up on the channel. She grew up in KwaZulu-Natal, in the Natal Midlands, very close to where I went to school. Okay, now, the final question. Wow, we've been going for over 3 hours. You've done well. You're a soldier, Peter. Renier Duplessis says, Dr. Peter, do you know which African leader said, when the white man came, they had the Bible and we had the land. Then we prayed. When we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible.
I do. I'm not sure who the very first to say it was, but I'm aware that Jomo Kenyatta said that back in the early 1960s. Of course, I heard Desmond Tutu say this in 1980s in Cape Town. They don't attribute it, so who knows who's been plagiarizing from who. But it's basically a Marxist thing. This actually comes all the way back to Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin was the first to popularize the idea, the myth, that rich countries are rich because of colonialism and because they exploit colonies. And of course, that's not true, because what made Sweden rich? Or they didn't have colonies. What made Switzerland rich? They didn't have colonies. And you could go through quite a lot of examples. And then countries are poor because they've been colonized. And that's not true, because why was Liberia and Ethiopia poverty-stricken? They'd never been colonized, and so on. So these things just, it doesn't fly. Some of the richest countries in the world were colonies, like Hong Kong, United States, and so on. South Africa, Australia used to be colonies. So it all falls down, but this was the myth that Vladimir Lenin did, and he believed that by getting aggrieved colonial people and teaching them that religion is the opiate of the masses, which of course was first said by Karl Marx, and to teach them. So it was actually Vladimir Lenin who first said that when the missionaries came, and what did he know? He'd never been to Africa. He'd never studied missions, but he said, when the missionaries came, we had the land and they had the Bible, and so let us pray, and then we had the Bible and they had the land. So actually, although some people may say Tutu said it or Kenyatta said it, actually they were all plagiarizing from Vladimir Lenin.
Isn't that interesting? Because really, when you think about it, that's psychological warfare at its best, isn't it?
It is. It's excellent Psyops. It's quite brilliant,
yeah.
And it's so insidiously dishonest. But it's effective false narrative, and a lot of people have done a lot of evil things because they believed a false narrative.
Yeah. All right, Peter. I just want to say thank you once again. We've been going for well over 3 hours. In fact, it's going. Yeah, it's well over 3 hours, and it's always an absolute pleasure to talk to you. You're such a knowledgeable man, and you've got some amazing information to share with us, which we really, really appreciate. I just want to turn my attention for a moment to the side chat and to people who are watching. Thank you guys for being part of our live stream tonight. Please tell your friends about it. I think it's been a fabulously informative session. I've learned a lot about psychological warfare. I mean, I'm a bit of a novice with this sort of stuff, but I guess when you're in my position, you've got to start looking at what it's all about. And to the moderators, guys, thank you so much for the incredible work you guys do. And finally, to our guest, Peter, would you like to just have a message for the people who are watching, or who might watch later?
Yes, indeed. Be strong and of good courage. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Let's fight the good fight of faith. When the time comes for you to stand up boldly. And when time comes for you to step out in faith. When time comes when you've got to speak up, speak out boldly and clearly with the words of Scripture. Do not fear them. Greater is he who is in us than him who is in the world.
Fantastic. Now, let's close off with a prayer, Peter, and if I can hand over to you to say a prayer for South Africa.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you for this technology. We thank you for friends across the seas. We thank you, Lord God, that we can have a unity in Christ even across hemispheres and oceans. And we praise you, Lord God, for your mercy, for your grace. We pray that you would intervene in our various countries, particularly in South Africa, where we have the wicked ruling over us, and we have your people under fear of attack on a nightly basis. And particularly we pray that you be an ever-present help in trouble for our farmers, that you be a shield and a fortress. We pray that you would strengthen them in their faith, that you would make them fast and accurate when they have to defend themselves, and make us all, we pray, Lord God, good neighbors to help and to stand by and to support and to speak out with others who are struggling and who are under threat. We thank you, Lord, for our friends in Australia, in America, and other parts of the world, and pray that you would help them to be allies and support for us as intercessors, as advocates, and to convince the elected representatives to bring pressure to bear on those who would steal our land and murder our people. May you, Lord God, be honored and glorified. We thank you that you're the ultimate judge. You're the King of kings and Lord of lords, that you will come again, that you will judge the living and the dead. We thank you that you will one day put all things right and that every knee will have to bow before you. We thank you, Lord God, for your power. We thank you for your mercy, for your grace, for your loving kindness. May you have mercy upon us. May you guide us. May you lead us. May you make us brave and bold. And when the time comes, Lord, make us fast and accurate and make us effective in what we communicate when we speak up for you. For we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for all those who helped organize. And God bless you. If you want to communicate with me, my personal email is peter@frontline.org.za.
Fantastic. Now, I'd like you to keep in touch with me regarding how it's going with these groups that you're working with.
Yes.
And maybe when you've got a session, some evening or whatever, perhaps we can have a live stream where we can have you all sitting down and just have a bit of a chat. I think it could be really interesting.
We could do that. I'm glad you're going to have our friend Jack Miller on. He's a good man. And his father is a real pioneer in Cape Independence. So good to have him on. We've been in the trenches on quite a few battles. Ask Jack Miller about when we had the parliamentary hearings on expropriation without compensation. He really saved the day. He boldly, when they wanted to shut him up, he stood up and he spoke boldly. There's actually a video clip, maybe that could be found, and he could have it sent there that you could show it, where he challenged this whole African National Congress farce. I published an article on fraud, failure, and farce on the expropriation of compensation hearings. But here's the one who stood up and he called them to account and he exposed them for the total fraud and failure they were. So Jack's he's a street fighter, good guy. He's a person many are looking forward to. So I think you'll have a good time with him on. And yes, let's see if we can get you on one of our Cape Independence Forum Zoom sessions. I hope one day we can get them all around a table in one room and we can live stream you, but in the meantime we might have to do it by Zoom.
Yeah, that's fine. Look, I'm just excited and keep up the fantastic work that you're doing, Peter. I mean, you just never stop. I'm just so amazed at I get your newsletter or your email every day from the Frontline Church, and I find that fascinating.
It's not meant to be every day, but at this, we've increased it during this lockdown and during all these things because there's just so much going on and the revolution and so on. So, there were times we sent out one a week or one every 2 weeks, and it just gotten to almost daily because the war's hotted up. It's like you've got to send out more artillery barrages.
Yeah, fantastic.
Missiles.
Righty, we'll chat again soon. I have no doubt.
Thanks, Scott. God bless and keep strong.
Thank you, and to everybody watching this now and later, please take care, guys, and please be safe. I'm signing out of the live stream now.